The Northern Origins. Our story begins not in the rolling hills of northwestern France, but in the mist-shrouded fjords and longhouses of Scandinavia. Here, seafaring warriors carve their names into the annals of history through steel and sail, through courage and cunning, through blood and determination. Among these Norse raiders, one figure stands paramount in the founding of what would become Normandy. His name was Rollo, though his contemporaries knew him as Ralph the Walker, a Viking chieftain whose physical stature, according to legend, prevented him from riding horses, forcing him to travel on foot even as he commanded fleets that terrorized the coasts of Europe. Rollo's origins remain shrouded in the mists of early medieval historiography. Sources suggest he hailed from either Norway or Denmark, but what remains certain is that by the early 10th century, he had established himself as a formidable leader among the Viking bands that had been ravaging the Seine Valley for decades. Unlike many of his contemporaries who sought quick plunder and retreat, Rollo demonstrated a strategic vision that extended beyond immediate gain. His forces had effectively controlled the lower Seine since approximately 896, establishing fortified positions along the river that allowed them to extract tribute from merchant vessels and launch raids deep into Frankish territory. The political landscape of early 10th century Francia provided the perfect opportunity for a pragmatic solution to what contemporaries called the Viking problem. Charles the Simple, King of West Francia, faced mounting pressure from multiple directions. Viking raids had devastated large portions of his kingdom. Internal nobles challenged his authority at every turn. External enemies threatened his borders from all sides. The traditional Frankish response of military confrontation had proven woefully inadequate against the mobile, well-organized Viking forces, who could strike swiftly and retreat to their river strongholds before effective retaliation could be mounted. Something revolutionary was needed, a completely new approach to this seemingly intractable problem. The negotiations that led to the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte in 911 represented a revolutionary approach to Viking settlement. Rather than continuing the exhausting cycle of raid and reprisal, Charles the Simple opted for a calculated gamble, transforming Viking raiders into Frankish vassals. The treaty granted Rollo and his followers control over the territory around Rouen, extending from the Epte River to the sea. In exchange, they would provide military service to the crown, and, in a delicious irony, protection of the Seine approaches against other Viking incursions. The raiders would become the guardians. The formal ceremony that sealed this agreement followed established Frankish feudal protocols, though with notable modifications that reflected the unique circumstances. Rollo performed the act of homage to Charles, placing his hands between those of the king and swearing fealty. However, contemporary accounts suggest that the proud Viking chieftain initially balked at the requirement to kiss the royal foot, a gesture of ultimate submission. Eventually, he delegated this particular gesture to one of his subordinates. This incident, while perhaps apocryphal, beautifully illustrates the cultural tensions inherent in transforming Norse warriors into Frankish vassals. A war-torn inheritance. The territory granted to Rollo encompassed roughly the modern departments of Seine-Maritime and Eure, a region that had suffered extensive depopulation due to decades of Viking raids. Archaeological evidence from sites like Rouen and Jumièges reveals a landscape marked by abandoned settlements, destroyed monasteries, and disrupted trade networks. The new Norman settlers inherited not a thriving province, but a war-torn frontier requiring extensive rebuilding and reorganization. This was no gift. It was a challenge that would test every aspect of their adaptability and resilience. Rollo's approach to governing his new domain demonstrated remarkable adaptability and political wisdom. Rather than imposing purely Scandinavian customs on the devastated region, he initiated a process of selective cultural integration that would define Norman identity for generations to come. The existing Frankish administrative structure, where it survived, was largely maintained. Norse settlers occupied key positions alongside remaining Gallo-Roman and Frankish officials. This pragmatic approach ensured continuity of governance while gradually introducing Scandinavian elements into the regional power structure. The transformation from Norse raiders to settled feudal lords occurred with surprising rapidity. Within a single generation, Rollo's followers had begun adopting Frankish customs, intermarrying with local populations, and converting to Christianity. The process was neither uniform nor complete. Archaeological evidence suggests that Scandinavian cultural practices persisted in certain areas, particularly in rural settlements and among the warrior elite. Grave goods from 10th century Norman burials reveal a fascinating mixture of Norse and Frankish influences. Viking-style weapons and jewelry are found alongside Christian religious symbols and Frankish ornaments. A material record of cultural synthesis occurring at the most personal level. The Christian transformation. The adoption of Christianity represented perhaps the most significant cultural shift among the Norman settlers. Rollo himself converted, taking the Christian name Robert at his baptism. Though the sincerity and completeness of early Norman conversions remain subjects of scholarly debate, the symbolic importance of this transformation cannot be overstated. The restoration and construction of churches and monasteries became a priority for Norman rulers, not merely as expressions of faith, but as symbols of political legitimacy and cultural integration. The Abbey of Jumièges, destroyed during earlier Viking raids, was rebuilt under Rollo's patronage, establishing a pattern of monastic support that would characterize Norman rule throughout their territories. This wasn't simply about religion. It was about demonstrating to the Frankish population and nobility that the Normans were no longer outsiders, but legitimate participants in Christendom and the European political order. Linguistic evolution. Linguistic transformation accompanied religious conversion in this remarkable cultural synthesis. The Norse language, while initially dominant among the Viking settlers, gradually gave way to the regional variety of Old French spoken in northern Francia. This transition occurred through multiple channels: intermarriage between Norse settlers and local Frankish populations, administrative necessity in governing a predominantly Frankish-speaking population, and the practical requirements of trade and commerce with neighboring regions. Within 2 generations, Norman rulers conducted official business in French, though Norse linguistic influences persisted in place names, legal terminology, and maritime vocabulary. Even today, the Norman dialect of French retains words and place names that echo its Scandinavian origins. Military innovation and synthesis. The military innovations developed by the Normans during this formative period reflected their unique position as former Viking raiders adapting to continental warfare. Traditional Scandinavian naval expertise was preserved and refined, with Norman fleets maintaining control over the Seine estuary and adjacent coastal waters. The Vikings' mastery of the sea would never be forgotten. However, the demands of feudal military service and territorial defense necessitated the adoption of Frankish cavalry tactics and fortification techniques. Norman military organization evolved into a sophisticated system that combined the best elements of both traditions, a synthesis that would prove devastatingly effective in campaigns across Europe and the Mediterranean. The traditional Viking emphasis on individual warrior prowess was channeled into the feudal concept of knightly service. Scandinavian tactical flexibility was adapted to mounted warfare. Norman cavalry units developed distinctive fighting techniques that emphasized coordinated charges and disciplined retreats, tactics that would later change the face of medieval warfare. The architecture of power. Fortification represented another crucial area of Norman innovation. The early settlers inherited a landscape dotted with Roman fortifications and Carolingian defensive works, many of which had fallen into disrepair during the chaotic Viking Age. Norman builders combined Scandinavian earthwork techniques with Frankish stone construction methods, creating a new style of fortification that emphasized both defensive strength and administrative efficiency. The Motte Bailey Castle, while not exclusively Norman in origin, was perfected and standardized by Norman builders during this period. These castles became more than military installations. They were symbols of power, centers of administration, and hubs of economic activity. The Norman castle would become one of the most recognizable features of the medieval landscape. Administrative excellence. Administrative innovations paralleled military developments in Norman territories. The Normans inherited the Carolingian administrative structure, but modified it to suit their particular needs and circumstances. The traditional Frankish county system was maintained, but with important modifications that reflected Scandinavian concepts of leadership and territorial organization. Norman administrators developed new methods of record-keeping, taxation, and judicial procedure that would later influence governmental practices throughout their expanding domains. This wasn't simply about collecting taxes. It was about creating stable, effective governance that could support long-term prosperity and military power. William Longsword, the second generation. Under William Longsword, Rollo's son and successor, Norman identity began to crystallize into its distinctive form. William's reign from 927 to 942 marked a crucial period in Norman development, as the second generation of Norman rulers faced the challenge of maintaining their unique cultural identity while fully integrating into Frankish political structures. This was a delicate balancing act, remaining Norman enough to maintain the loyalty of the warrior class while becoming Frankish enough to be accepted as legitimate rulers by the broader population and neighboring powers. William's marriage to Sprota, a Breton woman, exemplified the complex web of alliances and cultural exchanges that characterized Norman society during this formative period. These strategic marriages weren't just personal unions. They were political instruments that wove the Normans into the fabric of European aristocracy. William Longsword's reign witnessed significant territorial expansion and political consolidation. The Norman domain was extended westward to include the Cotentin Peninsula and the Avranches, regions that had remained outside direct Norman control since the original treaty with Charles the Simple. This expansion was achieved through a sophisticated combination of military conquest, diplomatic negotiation, and strategic marriage alliances that demonstrated the growing sophistication of Norman statecraft. The Normans were no longer simply warriors, they had become skilled politicians and administrators. Richard the Fearless. Full maturation. The reign of Richard the Fearless, spanning from 942 to 996, represented the full maturation of Norman political and cultural identity. Richard inherited the duchy as a child following his father's assassination, a traumatic beginning that could have spelled the end of Norman power. But Richard survived a turbulent minority through the support of loyal Norman nobles and strategic alliances with neighboring powers. His long reign provided the stability necessary for the complete integration of Norman society into the broader European political framework, while maintaining the distinctive characteristics that set the Normans apart from their neighbors. Richard the Fearless pursued policies that balanced Norman autonomy with French royal authority, a delicate equilibrium that required considerable diplomatic skill. His court at Rouen became a center of learning and culture, attracting scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across Europe. The Duke maintained cordial relations with the Capetian kings of France, while asserting Norman independence in matters of internal governance and external alliances. Legal synthesis. The emergence of distinct Norman legal traditions during this period reflected the unique synthesis of Scandinavian and Frankish customs that characterized Norman society. Norman customary law incorporated elements of Norse legal procedure, particularly in matters relating to property rights and commercial disputes, while adopting Frankish concepts of feudal obligation and royal authority. This legal synthesis would later prove highly influential in territories conquered by Norman armies from England to Sicily. The Norman approach to law, pragmatic, adaptable, and focused on effective governance, would become one of their most enduring legacies. A new European power. By the mid-11th century, something remarkable had occurred. The Normans had successfully transformed themselves from Viking raiders into one of the most dynamic and expansionist powers in medieval Europe. The Duchy of Normandy had become a model of effective feudal governance, combining strong central authority with local administrative efficiency. Norman knights had gained reputations as formidable warriors throughout Europe, their prowess in battle celebrated and feared in equal measure. Norman merchants and craftsmen had established trade networks that extended from Ireland to Constantinople, making Normandy prosperous as well as powerful. The distinctive Norman identity that emerged from this century and a half of cultural synthesis would soon project itself far beyond the boundaries of the duchy itself. As ambitious Norman nobles sought new territories to conquer and govern across the known world, they carried with them the lessons learned in transforming themselves from raiders to rulers. The crisis of 1066. Edward the Confessor. The death of Edward the Confessor on January 5, 1066, precipitated the most complex succession crisis in English history, setting in motion events that would fundamentally transform the political, social, and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. Edward's reign had been marked by increasing Norman influence at the English court, with Norman advisors, clergy, and nobles occupying positions of significant authority. This continental presence created deep tensions within the Anglo-Saxon nobility, particularly with the powerful Godwin family, whose patriarch Godwin of Wessex had been briefly exiled in 1051, following conflicts with Edward's Norman favorites. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the fate of England and reshape the destiny of Europe. 3 claimants, 3 visions. The succession question centered on 3 primary claimants, each presenting arguments rooted in different concepts of legitimate royal authority. Each believed they had the right to England's throne. Each was prepared to fight for it. Harald Godwinsson, Earl of Wessex and the most powerful noble in England, claimed the throne based on Edward's deathbed designation and the immediate election by the Witan, the Council of Anglo-Saxon Nobles and Clergy. His position represented the traditional English approach to royal succession, emphasizing the consent of the governed and the practical requirements of immediate leadership during a period of external threats. Harald was a proven military commander, a skilled administrator, and had the support of much of the English nobility. He seemed the natural choice, but legitimacy in medieval Europe was never simple. William's claim. William of Normandy's claim rested on fundamentally different legal foundations, drawing upon continental concepts of hereditary right and sworn obligations. William maintained that Edward had promised him the English throne during a visit to Normandy around 1051, when the childless king had allegedly designated his Norman cousin as heir. More controversially, William claimed that Harald Godwinsson had personally sworn an oath of fealty to him during a visit to Normandy in 1064 or 1065, promising to support William's succession to the English throne. If true, this oath would make Harald not just a rival claimant, but an oath-breaker, one of the worst crimes in medieval society. The oath controversy. The circumstances surrounding Harald's oath to William remain one of the most contentious issues in medieval historiography. Norman sources, particularly the Bayeux Tapestry and the chronicles of William of Jumièges and William of Poitiers, present Harold's visit as a diplomatic mission that concluded with his formal recognition of William's claim. According to these accounts, Harold swore his oath over sacred relics, making any subsequent violation a matter of both political treachery and religious perjury. The oath was binding not just in human law, but in divine law. Harold would be violating God's will itself if he broke it. English sources, by contrast, suggest that Harold's oath was extracted under duress, or that his mission to Normandy had entirely different purposes, possibly involving the release of hostages held by William since earlier diplomatic negotiations. The truth, lost in the partisan accounts of medieval chroniclers, may never be known with certainty. The Norwegian threat. Harald Hardrada of Norway presented the third major claim, based on agreements between his predecessor Magnus the Good and Harthacnut, the last Danish king of England. This claim, while legally tenuous, carried significant military weight, given Harald's reputation as one of the most formidable warriors of his generation. Harald Hardrada's career reads like an epic saga. He had fought at the Battle of Stiklestad, served in the elite Varangian Guard of Byzantium, campaigned across the Mediterranean, and returned to claim the Norwegian throne. He was a legend in his own time, and now he wanted England. His alliance with Tostig Godwinsson, Harold's exiled brother, provided him with detailed intelligence about English defenses and political divisions. The Norwegian invasion would be no mere raid. It would be a serious attempt at conquest. Military preparations. The Anglo-Saxon response. The military preparations undertaken by each claimant reflected their different strategic situations and resources. Harald Godwinsson, as the recognized King of England, commanded the traditional Anglo-Saxon military system based on the fyrd, a militia force that could be summoned from across the kingdom, supplemented by his personal retinue of housecarls, professional warriors, equipped with the fearsome Danish battle axes. The Anglo-Saxon military tradition emphasized infantry tactics, with heavily armored warriors forming shield walls that had proven effective against Viking raiders and Welsh princes for generations. These were not poorly trained peasants, but skilled warriors who had defended England's borders for decades. William's revolutionary logistics. William's military preparations represented a revolutionary approach to medieval warfare logistics. The Norman Duke assembled not merely an army, but an entire invasion force complete with prefabricated castle components, siege equipment, and supplies for an extended campaign. This was unprecedented. William wasn't planning a raid or even a simple conquest. He was planning a complete military occupation supported by the most sophisticated logistics of the medieval period. His forces included not only Norman knights, but contingents from across northern France, attracted by promises of English lands and the papal blessing that William had secured for his enterprise. The papal blessing. Pope Alexander II's support transformed William's invasion from a simple territorial dispute into a holy war, providing both moral authority and practical advantages in recruiting allies. The papal endorsement reflected broader ecclesiastical concerns about the state of the English Church under Anglo-Saxon rule. Norman reformers had criticized English clerical practices, particularly marriage of priests and the appointment of bishops by secular authorities. William's promise to reform the English Church, according to continental standards, aligned with the broader Gregorian reform movement, making his invasion appear as a mission of religious purification rather than mere conquest. With papal blessing, William could claim God was on his side. His warriors would fight not just for land and glory, but for the salvation of their souls. The fleet. The construction of William's invasion fleet represented an unprecedented logistical undertaking. Norman shipwrights, drawing upon their Scandinavian maritime heritage, constructed vessels capable of transporting not only warriors, but their horses, equipment, and supplies across the English Channel. Archaeological evidence suggests that these ships incorporated innovative design features that maximized cargo capacity while maintaining the seaworthiness necessary for channel crossings. The assembly of this fleet required coordinated efforts across multiple Norman ports, with Dive Soma serving as the primary staging area. Building a fleet capable of transporting thousands of men and hundreds of horses across one of the world's most treacherous waterways was an engineering marvel that demonstrated the sophisticated organizational capabilities the Normans had developed. The Norwegian invasion force. Harald Hardrada's invasion preparations followed more traditional Viking patterns, emphasizing speed and surprise over logistical complexity. His fleet of approximately 300 ships represented one of the largest Norse expeditions of the 11th century, drawing warriors from across Norway and allied territories. The Norwegian force included veterans of Harald's Byzantine campaigns, men experienced in siege warfare and unfamiliar tactical situations. Tostig's knowledge of English defensive preparations proved crucial in planning the invasion route and identifying potential landing sites. The summer of 1066. Waiting and watching. The summer of 1066 witnessed a complex strategic dance as the three armies maneuvered for advantage. Harald Godwinsson stationed his forces along the southern coast, anticipating William's invasion while maintaining watch for Harald Hardrada's approach from the north. The Anglo-Saxon king's strategic position was complicated by the seasonal limitations of the fyrd system. Militia forces could not be maintained indefinitely without disrupting agricultural activities essential for the kingdom's survival. Men needed to return home for the harvest, or England would face famine regardless of who wore the crown. William's invasion was delayed by unfavorable winds that trapped his fleet in Norman ports for several weeks. This delay proved strategically significant, as it forced Harald to dismiss portions of his southern defenses just as Harald Hardrada's fleet appeared off the Yorkshire coast. The winds that kept William trapped in port may have seemed like divine intervention, but they were working against Harald, not for him. The Norwegian landing. The Norwegian invasion began with landings at the mouth of the Humber River, followed by a rapid advance toward York, the second most important city in England. The Battle of Fulford on September 20th, 1066, demonstrated the continued effectiveness of Viking military tactics against traditional Anglo-Saxon forces. Harald Hardrada and Tostig defeated the northern earls Edwin and Morcar, opening the path to York and forcing Harald Godwinsson to march north with his household troops and whatever friared forces could be rapidly assembled. The Norwegian victory at Fulford was comprehensive, with contemporary sources suggesting that the northern English forces were virtually annihilated. This removed a significant portion of England's military strength just weeks before William's landing, a catastrophic blow that Harald Godwinsson would have to address immediately. Harald's response. A forced march. Harald's response to the Norwegian invasion showcased the remarkable mobility and organizational capacity of Anglo-Saxon military administration. The English king covered the 200 miles from London to Yorkshire in approximately 4 days, gathering additional forces during the march while maintaining the element of surprise. This rapid movement allowed Harald to attack the Norwegian forces at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, before they could consolidate their conquest of northern England. The speed of this march remains one of the most impressive military movements in medieval history. Stamford Bridge. The end of the Viking Age. The Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, marked the end of the Viking Age in England. Harald Hardrada fell alongside Tostig and the majority of their forces. The Norwegian defeat was so complete that only 24 ships were required to transport the survivors back to Norway, compared to the 300 vessels that had brought the invasion force. Harald's victory eliminated one of the 3 claimants to the English throne, while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of Anglo-Saxon military organization under competent leadership. For a brief moment, it seemed Harald had secured his throne. But even as Harald celebrated his victory in Yorkshire, Norman ships were crossing the Channel. William lands at Pevensey. William's landing at Pevensey on September 28, 1066, occurred while Harald was still in Yorkshire, celebrating his victory over the Norwegians. The Norman invasion force, numbering approximately 7,000 men including 2,000 cavalry, established a fortified beachhead and began systematic devastation of the surrounding countryside. This deliberate destruction served multiple purposes. It provided supplies for the Norman army, denied resources to English forces, and provoked Harald into a rapid response that might prevent him from fully assembling his military strength. William was playing a calculated game, and Harald had no choice but to respond. The race south. The march south from Yorkshire to meet William's invasion represented one of the most demanding military movements in medieval English history. Harold's forces covered approximately 250 miles in less than 2 weeks, pausing only briefly in London to gather additional troops and supplies. The speed of this movement, while strategically necessary, meant that many potential reinforcements were unable to join Harold's army before the decisive battle. Harold's brothers urged him to wait, to gather his full strength. But with William devastating his lands and threatening his crown, Harald felt he had no choice but to march immediately. It was a decision that would change history. The Battle of Hastings. October 14, 1066. The Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, represented a clash between 2 fundamentally different military traditions and tactical approaches. This was more than a battle for a crown. It was a confrontation between different ways of making war, different cultures, different futures for England. Harold's army, positioned on Senlac Hill approximately 7 miles northwest of Hastings, arranged in the traditional shield wall formation. This defensive position maximized the advantages of Anglo-Saxon infantry tactics, while minimizing the mobility advantages of Norman cavalry. The shield wall. The Anglo-Saxon shield wall represented the culmination of centuries of tactical development. Heavily armored warriors using interlocked shields created an impenetrable barrier against enemy attacks. The housecarls, professional warriors in royal service, wielded two-handed Danish axes capable of cleaving through mail armor and horseflesh with equal effectiveness. Behind this front rank, third spearmen provided additional depth and missile support, while archers and slingers harassed enemy formations from the flanks. This formation had defended England for generations, and Harold trusted it with his life and his kingdom. Norman combined arms. William's army employed the combined arms tactics that had made Norman forces formidable throughout Europe. Norman heavy cavalry, mounted on specially bred war horses and equipped with long lances, formed the core of the invasion force. These knights were supported by infantry contingents armed with spears and crossbows, while Breton and Flemish allies provided additional tactical flexibility. The Norman tactical system emphasized coordinated attacks that combined missile fire, infantry assault, and cavalry charges to break enemy formation. It was a sophisticated system that required discipline, coordination, and skilled leadership, all of which William possessed. The battle begins. The battle commenced with Norman archers attempting to disrupt the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, followed by infantry attacks designed to create gaps for cavalry exploitation. The initial Norman assaults proved unsuccessful against the disciplined Anglo-Saxon formation, with English axes and spears taking a heavy toll on attacking forces. Contemporary accounts describe fierce fighting around the English standards, where Harold's banner of the fighting man marked the center of Anglo-Saxon resistance. The Norman cavalry charged up the hill repeatedly, only to be thrown back by the disciplined English warriors. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. The English seemed to have the advantage of position and formation. But then came the turning point. The fatal pursuit. The turning point came when a portion of the Norman left wing, composed primarily of Breton cavalry, broke and fled down the hill. Part of the English right wing, believing the battle won, pursued the retreating Normans, and were cut down by William's reserve cavalry once they left the protection of the shield wall. This tactical error, repeated several times during the battle, gradually weakened the English position by drawing defenders away from their advantageous position. Whether this was deliberate deception by the Normans or simply opportunistic exploitation of English mistakes remains debated by historians. William's leadership. William's personal leadership proved crucial during the battle's most critical moments. When rumors spread that the Norman Duke had been killed, he removed his helmet and rode among his troops to demonstrate his survival, rallying his forces for renewed attacks. This display of personal courage, combined with tactical flexibility that adapted to changing battlefield conditions, exemplified the leadership qualities that had made William one of the most successful commanders of his generation. He led from the front, visible to his men, sharing their dangers, and inspiring them to victory. The death of Harold. The death of Harald Godwinsson, struck down by Norman arrows or cavalry late in the day, marked the collapse of organized Anglo-Saxon resistance. With their king dead and their formation broken, the surviving English forces fled toward the Weald, pursued by Norman cavalry that inflicted additional casualties during the retreat. The battle had lasted from morning until dusk, with losses particularly heavy among the Anglo-Saxon nobility and housecarl retinues that formed the core of English military strength. The English had fought bravely, but it hadn't been enough. England had a new king, and nothing would ever be the same. The march on London. William's advance on London following his victory at Hastings demonstrated the systematic approach that would characterize Norman conquest and administration. Rather than marching directly on the capital, William moved along the coast to secure Dover and its crucial harbor facilities, then swept in a wide arc through Kent and Surrey, devastating the countryside and eliminating potential centers of resistance. This methodical approach allowed Norman forces to establish secure supply lines while demonstrating the futility of continued resistance. William wasn't simply conquering territory. He was systematically dismantling any possibility of organized English resistance. The submission of London. The submission of London occurred through negotiation rather than siege. as the remaining Anglo-Saxon nobles recognized the impossibility of successful resistance. Edgar the Atheling, the last male heir of the Anglo-Saxon royal house, was proclaimed king by the surviving nobles, but lacked the military strength to oppose William's advance. The formal surrender of London on December 25, 1066, was followed by William's coronation at Westminster Abbey, conducted according to traditional English coronation rituals. William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, became William I, King of England. William the Conqueror. The rebellions begin. But coronation didn't mean complete conquest. The early years of Norman rule were marked by widespread rebellions that required systematic military campaigns to suppress. English nobles who had initially submitted now rose in revolt, unwilling to accept foreign domination. The most serious uprising occurred in 1069 to 1070, when Edgar the Atheling allied with King Svein Estridsson of Denmark to launch a coordinated assault on Norman positions throughout northern England. The Danish fleet, numbering over 200 ships, sailed up the Humber and captured York, while English rebels seized control of much of Yorkshire and Northumbria. For a moment, it seemed Norman rule might collapse. But William's response would be so terrible, so complete, that England would never forget it. The harrying of the North. William's response to the Northern Rebellion demonstrated the ruthless efficiency that would characterize Norman rule throughout the conquest period. The harrying of the North, conducted during the winter of 1069 to 1008, involved the systematic destruction of settlements, livestock, and agricultural resources across Yorkshire, Durham, and parts of Northumbria. Contemporary chronicles describe a campaign of deliberate devastation designed to eliminate the economic foundation of rebellion, while creating a buffer zone against Scottish intervention. This wasn't just military action. It was systematic, calculated destruction intended to break English resistance forever. A landscape of devastation. The scale of destruction during the harrying of the North was unprecedented in English history. Norman forces burned villages, slaughtered livestock, destroyed grain stores, and poisoned wells across a region, extending from the Humber to the Tees. Archaeological evidence supports contemporary accounts of widespread abandonment of settlements, with many villages not reoccupied for decades after the campaign. The Domesday Book, compiled 20 years later, records vast areas of northern England as waste, indicating the long-term demographic and economic impact of William's scorched earth tactics. The harrying of the North broke English resistance, but at a terrible cost. Thousands died, not in battle, but from starvation during the brutal winter that followed. It was effective, ruthless, and unforgettable. Castles, symbols of conquest. The construction of castles represented perhaps the most visible symbol of Norman conquest and control. Within 20 years of Hastings, the Normans had constructed over 500 castles throughout England, fundamentally altering both the physical and political landscape of the kingdom. These fortifications served multiple purposes, providing secure bases for Norman garrisons, controlling important river crossings and road junctions, and demonstrating Norman power to potentially rebellious populations. Every castle was a statement. We are here. We are in control. Resistance is futile. Speed of construction. Norman castle construction in England initially followed the motte and bailey pattern perfected in Normandy, featuring artificial mounds topped by wooden towers and surrounded by fortified enclosures. The speed of construction was remarkable, with contemporary sources indicating that major castles could be completed within weeks using impressed local labor and prefabricated components. The Tower of London, begun immediately after the conquest, exemplified Norman architectural ambition, combining defensive strength with symbolic grandeur to overawe the conquered population. It stood as a permanent reminder of Norman power, and still stands today. The replacement of the English nobility. The replacement of the Anglo-Saxon nobility represented a social revolution as comprehensive as the military conquest itself. By 1086, only two major English landholders retained their estates, with Norman, Breton, and Flemish nobles controlling virtually all significant holdings. This transformation occurred through a combination of conquest, confiscation, and strategic redistribution, designed to reward William's supporters while eliminating potential centers of English resistance. The Old English aristocracy was systematically dismantled and replaced with loyal Norman vassals. The Feudal Revolution. The introduction of continental feudalism revolutionized English land tenure and military organization. The Anglo-Saxon system of Bookland and Falkland gave way to Norman concepts of feudal tenure, where all land was held ultimately from the king in exchange for specified military and financial obligations. This transformation required detailed surveys of landholding and population, culminating in the compilation of the Domesday Book between 1085 and 86. The Domesday Survey. The Domesday Survey represented an unprecedented administrative undertaking, recording the ownership, value, and obligations of virtually every piece of land in England. Royal commissioners traveled throughout the kingdom, gathering information from local juries and cross-referencing their findings to ensure accuracy. The resulting record provided William with detailed knowledge of his kingdom's resources, while establishing the legal foundation for feudal tenure. Nothing like it existed anywhere else in Europe. It was a testament to Norman administrative sophistication and thoroughness. Ecclesiastical transformation. The ecclesiastical transformation of England paralleled the secular conquest, as Norman bishops and abbots replaced Anglo-Saxon church leaders throughout the kingdom. Lanfranc of Beek, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070, spearheaded comprehensive reforms that aligned English church practices with continental standards. These changes included the enforcement of clerical celibacy, the reorganization of diocesan boundaries, and the introduction of canon law based on Roman precedents. The English church, like English society, was being remade in the Norman image. Legal innovation. Norman legal innovations fundamentally altered English judicial procedures and concepts of royal authority. The Anglo-Saxon system of local courts and customary law was supplemented by royal courts applying Norman legal principles, while the concept of the king's peace was extended throughout the realm. Forest law, imported from Normandy, restricted hunting rights and imposed severe penalties for violations, generating significant revenue while symbolizing royal authority over the natural landscape. Even the forests belonged to the king now. Economic transformation. The economic transformation of England under Norman rule reflected both the disruption of conquest and the benefits of integration into continental trade networks. The systematic replacement of Anglo-Saxon coinage with Norman designs facilitated trade with the continent, while the establishment of new markets and towns encouraged commercial development. The construction of castles and cathedrals provided employment for craftsmen and laborers, while the demand for luxury goods by the Norman elite stimulated artisanal production. Despite the violence of conquest, Norman rule brought economic integration with the broader European economy. Conclusion. A new world order. The transformation of England under Norman rule created ripple effects that extended far beyond the boundaries of William's new kingdom. While the conqueror consolidated his hold on English territories, other Norman nobles sought opportunities for advancement and conquest in distant lands. The restless energy that had driven Viking raiders across the seas now propelled Norman knights toward new frontiers, carrying with them the military innovations and administrative expertise that had proven so effective in England. Among these adventurers, none would achieve greater success than those who turned their attention to the fractured political landscape of southern Italy and Sicily. There, in the sun-drenched lands of the Mediterranean, Norman warriors would create kingdoms that rivaled anything achieved in England. Kingdoms that would become crucibles of cultural synthesis, centers of learning, and bastions of Christian power against the Muslim world. The story of the Normans in the Mediterranean, their conquest of Sicily, their role in the Crusades, and their creation of one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated multicultural kingdoms. That extraordinary tale of adventure, conquest, and cultural synthesis awaits us in Part 2. For now, we leave England transformed. The Viking raiders who once terrorized the coasts of Europe had become the Normans, masters of adaptation, innovation, and conquest. They had conquered Normandy through treaty, England through battle, and would soon extend their reach across the Mediterranean world. The Norman century had only just begun, and its greatest achievements still lay ahead. But that is a story that will have to wait for a little while. First, I would like to take the opportunity to ask you where you are listening from. What part of the world you are in tonight. I'm always fascinated when I see that people in the US are listening to my stories, or that someone in India have found my channel. So please tell me in the comments. I am genuinely interested. Well, enough of that now. Let's continue. Where were we? I remember now. We witnessed the extraordinary transformation of Viking raiders into Norman rulers. From Rollo's settlement in Normandy to William the Conqueror's triumph at Hastings, we saw how the Normans mastered the art of adaptation, creating sophisticated administrative systems and military innovations that changed the face of medieval Europe. But the story of Norman ambition doesn't end in England. Even as William consolidated his conquest, other Norman warriors were turning their gaze southward, toward the sun-drenched lands of the Mediterranean, where opportunity and fortune awaited those bold enough to seize them. What follows is perhaps the most remarkable chapter in the Norman saga, a tale of adventurers who carved kingdoms from the fractured political landscape of southern Italy and Sicily, crusaders who established principalities in the Holy Land, and rulers who created one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated multicultural civilizations. The military organization of Antioch. The military organization of the Principality of Antioch represented a fascinating synthesis of traditional Norman feudal structures, with adaptations necessitated by the unique strategic situation of a crusading state surrounded by Muslim territories. The establishment of a feudal hierarchy based on military service obligations provided the foundation for territorial defense. But this was no simple transplantation of European feudalism to the east. The recruitment of local Christian warriors, Armenians, Syrian Christians, and Greeks, and even the employment of Muslim mercenaries reflected practical necessities that transcended religious and cultural boundaries. This was survival, pure and simple. Ideology was a luxury the Normans couldn't always afford. The integration of Eastern military techniques and equipment into Norman tactical systems demonstrated the same adaptability that had enabled Norman success in diverse military environments. From England to Sicily, Norman commanders learned from their enemies, adopting Turkish archery techniques, Byzantine siege methods, and Arab cavalry tactics to create hybrid military forces that combined the best of both worlds. Fortifying the frontier. The fortification program, undertaken in the Principality of Antioch, represented one of the most ambitious construction projects of the crusading period. Norman engineers adapted European castle-building techniques to the specific defensive requirements of frontier warfare against Muslim armies, employing sophisticated siege equipment and tactics. The construction of new fortifications and the strengthening of existing defenses required substantial financial resources and technical expertise, resources that demonstrated the economic prosperity and administrative capabilities of the Norman Principality despite its precarious strategic position. The strategic placement of castles and fortified towns created an integrated defensive system that controlled key mountain passes and river crossings while providing secure bases for offensive operations against Muslim territories. Every fortress was positioned not just for defense, but as a launching point for raids and conquests. The Normans remained aggressive even when surrounded. Architectural innovation in the East. The architectural innovations developed in Norman Antioch reflected the synthesis of Western European, Byzantine, and Islamic building traditions that characterized crusading states throughout the Levant. Norman builders incorporated pointed arches, decorative stonework, and advanced siege defense features learned from Muslim engineers, while maintaining the massive structural strength and residential accommodations required by European feudal nobles. The resulting architectural style influenced fortress construction throughout the crusading states, while demonstrating the cultural exchange that occurred despite, or perhaps because of, the religious conflicts that defined the crusading period. These weren't just military installations. They were statements of permanence, declarations that the Normans had come to stay. They were homes built to withstand centuries, not decades. Economic mastery. The economic policies implemented in the Principality of Antioch demonstrated Norman understanding of the commercial importance of their territories within broader Mediterranean and Middle Eastern trade networks. The protection of merchant caravans and the establishment of secure markets attracted traders from across the region, generating customs revenues that supported military expenses and construction projects. The Principality's strategic position controlling routes between the Mediterranean ports and the interior regions of Syria and Mesopotamia provided substantial economic advantages. The Normans understood something fundamental. Military power rested on economic prosperity. Control the trade routes. Secure the merchants. And the gold would flow. Gold that could pay for soldiers, fortifications, and the luxuries that made frontier life bearable. The art of survival. Norman diplomacy. The diplomatic relationships that Norman Antioch maintained with neighboring Muslim and Christian powers reflected the complex political situation of the crusading states, where survival often depended upon tactical alliances that transcended religious boundaries. Bohemond and his successors negotiated treaties with Muslim rulers when military circumstances required accommodation, while maintaining alliances with other crusading states and seeking support from Western European powers when opportunities for expansion presented themselves. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was pragmatism. The Normans had learned long ago that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally, and that rigid ideology was a path to destruction. The flexibility of Norman diplomatic policies contrasted with the more rigid ideological approaches adopted by some other crusading leaders, contributing to the longevity and success of the Antiochian Principality. Succession and stability. The succession arrangements established for the Principality of Antioch reflected both Norman feudal traditions and the unique circumstances of a crusading state, dependent upon continued military effectiveness for survival. The designation of Bohemond's nephew, Tancred, as regent during his uncle's absence demonstrated the importance of maintaining experienced military leadership. The eventual succession of Bohemond II illustrated the successful establishment of hereditary rule within the Principality, no small achievement in the volatile world of the crusading states. The integration of local noble families into the Norman feudal hierarchy through marriage alliances and land grants created a stable foundation for long-term Norman rule in northern Syria. The Normans understood that conquest was just the beginning. Real power came from creating systems that would outlast individual rulers. Military innovation and influence. The military innovations developed by Norman commanders in Antioch influenced crusading warfare throughout the Levant, as tactical adaptations necessitated by fighting Muslim armies were adopted by other crusading states and transmitted back to Western Europe through returning crusaders and military correspondents. The integration of Turkish archery techniques with Western European cavalry charges created new tactical systems that enhanced the effectiveness of crusading armies. The adoption of Muslim siege equipment and engineering techniques improved the capability of Christian forces to capture and defend fortified positions. This cross-cultural military learning represented one of the most significant and often overlooked aspects of the crusading period. The Normans, with their genius for adaptation, led the way in this military revolution. Cultural achievement in a war zone. The cultural achievements of Norman Antioch reflected the cosmopolitan character of the Principality, where Norman patronage supported artistic and intellectual activities that drew upon diverse cultural traditions. The court at Antioch attracted scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across the Mediterranean world, creating an environment of cultural exchange that produced architectural monuments and artistic achievements that synthesized Western European. Even in the midst of almost constant warfare, culture flourished. The preservation and translation of classical texts in the Principality's libraries contributed to the broader intellectual developments of the 12th century Renaissance. War and learning, surprisingly, could coexist, and under Norman rule, they did. The Angevin Empire. a new chapter. The death of Stephen of Blois in October 1154 brought to an end the chaotic period known as the Anarchy, ushering in a new era of Norman rule under Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. Henry's accession to the English throne as Henry II marked not merely a change of dynasty, but the creation of the most extensive territorial empire in Western Europe since Charlemagne. The young king, barely 21 years old, inherited a realm that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, encompassing England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the vast duchies of Aquitaine and Gascony. This was an empire that dwarfed anything his Norman predecessors had controlled. Managing it would require administrative genius of the highest order. The challenge of empire. The administrative challenges posed by governing such dispersed territories required innovations that built upon existing Norman governmental traditions, while adapting to the diverse legal, cultural, and political conditions found across the Angevin domains. Henry II inherited administrative systems that had been refined through nearly a century of Norman rule in England, where the Conqueror's successors had developed sophisticated mechanisms for royal revenue collection, judicial administration, and military organization. The extension of these proven administrative techniques to continental territories created unprecedented opportunities for governmental efficiency and royal control. But it also created unprecedented challenges. How do you govern territories separated by hundreds of miles, speaking different languages, with different legal traditions and customs? The answer lay in bureaucracy, systematic, professional, and efficient. Building a unified administration. The establishment of a unified administrative apparatus across the Angevin territories represented one of Henry II's most significant achievements. Royal officials trained in Norman administrative methods were deployed throughout the empire to standardize governmental procedures and ensure consistent implementation of royal policies. The creation of itinerant justices who traveled regular circuits throughout England and the continental domains provided mechanisms for extending royal authority into local communities while maintaining centralized oversight of judicial decisions and administrative actions. These weren't just judges. They were the eyes and ears of the king, ensuring that royal authority reached into every corner of the realm. They investigated corruption, settled disputes, collected revenues, and reminded local populations that the king's justice was supreme. The legal revolution. The development of standardized legal procedures under Henry II built upon foundations established by his Norman predecessors while introducing innovations that would fundamentally transform English jurisprudence. The Constitutions of Clarendon, promulgated in 1164, attempted to define the relationship between royal and ecclesiastical authority by codifying legal procedures that had developed pragmatically during previous reigns. These constitutional provisions reflected Henry's determination to assert royal supremacy over all aspects of governance within his territories, including matters that had traditionally fallen under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. This would prove to be one of the most contentious issues of Henry's reign and would lead to tragedy. The expansion of royal justice. The expansion of royal courts throughout the Angevin territories created institutional frameworks for dispensing standardized justice that transcended local customs and jurisdictions. The establishment of common law procedures provided consistent legal remedies for property disputes, commercial conflicts, and criminal prosecutions that had previously been subject to the varying interpretations of local courts. The development of standardized legal writs enabled petitioners to initiate court proceedings through uniform procedures that could be understood and implemented by royal officials throughout the empire. This was revolutionary, the creation of a truly unified legal system spanning multiple kingdoms and cultures. The power of records. The creation of systematic record-keeping procedures under Henry II revolutionized royal administration by providing detailed documentation of governmental activities that enabled more effective oversight and policy implementation. The establishment of the chancery rolls, patent rolls, and close roles created comprehensive archives of royal correspondence, judicial decisions, and administrative orders that provided institutional memory and legal precedents for future governmental actions. These records demonstrated the sophisticated bureaucratic capabilities that Norman administrative traditions had developed through decades of practical experience in governing diverse territories. More importantly, they meant that government could function even in the king's absence. The system had become larger than any individual. Judicial innovation. The judicial innovations implemented during Henry II's reign established legal institutions that would influence English jurisprudence for centuries to come. The creation of permanent royal courts at Westminster provided centralized venues for hearing major legal cases, while the expansion of circuit courts ensured that royal justice was accessible throughout the kingdom. The development of jury procedures for determining facts in legal disputes represented a significant departure from early reliance on ordeal and combat, creating more rational methods for resolving complex legal questions. The jury system, one of the most enduring legacies of Norman legal innovation, began to take its modern form under Henry II died. Adapting law to empire. The standardization of legal procedures across the Anjuvin territories required careful adaptation of Norman legal traditions to accommodate the diverse customary laws found in different regions of the empire. In Normandy, existing ducal administrative systems provided foundations for royal government. In Aquitaine and Gascony, the integration of Roman law traditions with northern French customary practices created complex jurisdictional questions that required sophisticated legal expertise to resolve. The development of legal procedures that could accommodate these diverse traditions while maintaining royal authority represented a significant administrative achievement. It was legal synthesis on a scale never before attempted in medieval Europe. Building the bureaucracy. The expansion of royal bureaucracy under Henry II created career opportunities for educated clerks and administrators who formed the backbone of Anjuvin governmental efficiency. The recruitment of personnel from cathedral schools and emerging universities provided the crown with administrators possessing the literacy and numerical skills necessary for complex record-keeping and financial management. The development of standardized administrative procedures enabled these officials to transfer between different territories within the empire while maintaining consistent governmental operation. This professional civil service, trained, literate, and loyal to the crown, rather than local magnates, represented a fundamental shift in medieval governance. Financial innovation. The financial innovations implemented during Henry II's reign built upon Norman fiscal traditions while adapting to the increased complexity of governing multiple territories with different monetary systems and taxation practices. The development of the exchequer system provided sophisticated mechanisms for royal revenue collection and expenditure tracking that enabled more effective financial management across the diverse territories of the Angevin Empire. The creation of standardized accounting procedures allowed royal officials to monitor revenues and expenditures with unprecedented precision. The exchequer, named for the checkered cloth on which calculations were performed, became one of the most sophisticated financial institutions in medieval Europe. Military obligations and reform. The military obligations imposed upon feudal tenants throughout the Angevin territories reflected both traditional Norman service requirements and adaptations necessitated by the empire's extensive frontiers and diverse strategic challenges. The scutage system, which allowed monetary payments in lieu of personal military service, provided royal treasuries with flexible resources for hiring professional soldiers and financing extended campaigns across multiple theaters of operation. The development of professional military forces supplemented traditional feudal levies while providing more reliable military capabilities for defending the empire's extensive borders. The age of the purely feudal army was ending. The age of professional soldiers was beginning. The Becket crisis. Challenge to royal authority. The conflict between Henry II and Thomas Becket represented the most serious challenge to royal authority during the early Angevin period, highlighting fundamental tensions between secular and ecclesiastical concepts of governmental supremacy. Becket's transformation from royal chancellor to uncompromising defender of ecclesiastical privileges created a personal and political crisis that threatened to undermine Henry's carefully constructed administrative systems. The archbishop's insistence on ecclesiastical immunity from royal jurisdiction challenged basic principles of Norman royal authority that had been established through decades of practical governance. This wasn't just a political dispute. It was a fundamental clash over the nature of power itself, the making of a crisis. The appointment of Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162 reflected Henry's confidence that his former chancellor would support royal policies regarding ecclesiastical administration and clerical privileges. Becket's previous service as chancellor had demonstrated his administrative capabilities and apparent loyalty to royal interests, making his subsequent opposition to Henry's ecclesiastical policies both unexpected and particularly threatening to royal authority. The transformation of the king's closest advisor into his most implacable opponent created a crisis that tested the stability of Anjuvin governmental institutions. How had it come to this? The answer lay in the clash between two strong-willed men, each convinced of the righteousness of his cause. The Constitutions of Clarendon. The Constitutions of Clarendon represented Henry's systematic attempt to define the boundaries between royal and ecclesiastical authority by codifying practices that had developed during previous reigns. The 16 clauses of the Constitutions address specific areas of jurisdictional conflict, including the trial of criminous clerks, appeals to Rome, and the movement of ecclesiastical personnel. Becket's initial acceptance, followed by subsequent repudiation of these provisions, created a constitutional crisis that threatened the legal foundations of royal government throughout the Angevin territories. The archbishop had drawn a line in the sand, and Henry could not afford to let it stand. Exile and resistance. The exile of Thomas Becket from 1164 to 1000 demonstrated both the international dimensions of the conflict and the limitations of royal authority when confronted by determined ecclesiastical opposition supported by papal authority. Becket's residence at the Cistercian Abbey of Pontigny, and later at Sens, provided him with platforms for organizing opposition to Henry's ecclesiastical policies, while maintaining communication networks with supporters throughout the Angevin territories. The archbishop's ability to sustain his resistance, despite royal pressure, illustrated the continuing strength of ecclesiastical institutions and international support networks. The church could protect its own, even against the most powerful king in Christendom. Murder in the Cathedral. The murder of Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on December 29, 17, created a martyrdom that transformed a political dispute into a religious crisis with international ramifications. The four knights who killed the archbishop claimed to be acting on Henry's behalf, though the king's exact role in ordering or encouraging the murder remains historically controversial. The immediate transformation of Becket into a popular saint created a cult that challenged royal authority while providing focal points for opposition to Angevin governmental policies. The words "will no one rid me of this turbulent priest," whether spoken or not, would haunt Henry for the rest of his life. Royal penance. The penance performed by Henry II at Becket's tomb in July of 1174 represented a dramatic acknowledgement of the limitations of royal authority when confronted by popular religious sentiment and ecclesiastical opposition. The king's public submission to ecclesiastical punishment, stripped to the waist and scourged by monks, demonstrated the continuing power of the church to constrain royal actions even at the height of Angevin administrative development. The compromise arrangements that followed Becket's martyrdom established precedents for ecclesiastical autonomy that would influence church-state relations throughout the medieval period. Henry had lost this battle, and the memory of that loss would shape English politics for generations. The Great Revolt, testing the system. The Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174 tested the stability of Angevin governmental institutions when Henry's sons, supported by the French king and disaffected nobles, challenged royal authority across multiple territories simultaneously. The rebellion demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the administrative systems that Henry had constructed. Royal officials maintained governmental operations in most areas, while military forces loyal to the crown suppressed rebellious activities. The successful defense of the empire against coordinated internal and external threats validated the effectiveness of Norman administrative traditions adapted to Angevin conditions. The system worked, even when the king's own sons sought to destroy it. Victory and its lessons. The capture of Henry the young king and the submission of his brothers marked the successful resolution of the Great Revolt, though the underlying tensions that had precipitated the rebellion continued to influence Angevin politics throughout Henry II's reign. The king's ability to maintain control over his extensive territories, despite serious military challenges, demonstrated the effectiveness of the administrative and military systems that had been developed through decades of Norman governmental experience. The loyalty of royal officials and the efficiency of administrative communications enabled coordinated responses to threats across the empire's diverse territories. Bureaucracy, it turned out, could be more reliable than blood. Later legal reforms. The legal reforms implemented during the later years of Henry II's reign built upon earlier innovations, while addressing specific problems that had emerged through practical experience in governing the Angevin territories. The Assize of Northampton in 1176 expanded the jurisdiction of royal courts, while standardizing procedures for criminal prosecution throughout England. The development of possessory assizes provided efficient mechanisms for resolving property disputes without requiring complex determinations of ultimate legal right, creating practical solutions for common legal problems. These weren't just legal technicalities. They were tools that ordinary people could use to seek justice. Henry's administrative legacy. The administrative legacy of Henry II's reign established institutional foundations that would enable his successors to maintain governmental efficiency despite the personal inadequacies and political challenges that characterized later Angevin rule. The creation of professional administrative cadres, standardized legal procedures, and systematic record-keeping practices provided continuity of governmental operations that transcended individual royal capabilities. The development of these institutional frameworks represented the culmination of Norman administrative evolution, from the pragmatic innovations of William the Conqueror to the sophisticated bureaucratic systems of the late 12th century. Richard the Lionheart, the absent king. The accession of Richard in 1189 marked a significant shift in Angevin priorities, as the new king's obsession with crusading activities led to prolonged absences from his territories that tested the administrative systems established by his father. Richard's departure for the Third Crusade within months of his coronation left England and the continental territories under the governance of appointed officials whose authority depended entirely upon the institutional frameworks that Henry II had created. The successful maintenance of governmental operations during Richard's absence demonstrated the maturity and effectiveness of Norman administrative traditions. The system could run without the king, perhaps the ultimate testament to Henry's administrative genius. Financing the crusade. The financial demands imposed by Richard's crusading activities required unprecedented levels of taxation and revenue collection that strained the fiscal systems developed during Henry II's reign. The implementation of the Saladin tithe and other extraordinary levies tested the capacity of royal administrative machinery, while demonstrating the sophisticated revenue collection capabilities that had been developed through decades of Norman fiscal innovation. The ability to generate substantial resources for crusading expenses while maintaining domestic governmental operations illustrated the effectiveness of Angevin financial administration. England, in effect, financed Richard's adventure in the Holy Land, whether the English liked it or not. Regency and continuity. The regency arrangements established during Richard's absence created complex questions of authority and jurisdiction that were resolved through the application of administrative procedures and legal precedents established during previous reigns. The appointment of William Longchamp as Chief Justiciar provided centralized leadership for royal administration, while the retention of existing administrative personnel ensured continuity of governmental operations. The successful management of domestic affairs during the king's prolonged absence validated the institutional strength of Norman administrative systems. Government had become truly institutional, larger than any single person, even the king. King John, crisis and catastrophe. The crisis created by John's accession in 1199, following Richard's death in France, precipitated conflicts that would ultimately test the fundamental principles of Norman royal authority. John's disputed succession, challenged by his nephew Arthur of Brittany, created uncertainties about royal legitimacy that were compounded by military failures and administrative incompetence that undermined confidence in Anjuvin governmental capabilities. John was intelligent, hardworking, and personally brave, but he lacked the charisma and luck that had blessed his predecessors. And in medieval kingship, luck and charisma mattered as much as competence. The loss of Normandy. The loss of Normandy to Philip Augustus in 1204 represented the most serious territorial defeat suffered by Norman rulers since the conquest of England, fundamentally altering the strategic and political foundations of Angevin power. The military campaigns that led to the loss of Normandy demonstrated both the strategic vulnerabilities of the Angevin Empire and the limitations of administrative efficiency when confronted by determined external pressure and internal disloyalty. Philip Augustus's systematic conquest of Norman strongholds revealed weaknesses in the defensive systems that had protected the duchy for over a century, while the defection of Norman nobles to the French crown illustrated the fragility of feudal loyalties when royal leadership proved inadequate. The fall of Chateau Gauyar. The fall of Chateau Gauyar in March 1204 symbolized the collapse of Norman resistance and the end of the territorial connection between England and Normandy that had defined Anglo-Norman identity since 1066. The saucy castle, as Richard the Lionheart had proudly called his greatest architectural achievement, had fallen after a siege that demonstrated French military superiority. With it fell the last realistic hope of holding Normandy. The duchy that Rollo had founded nearly 3 centuries earlier was now part of France. The Norman connection was severed forever. Administrative consequences. The administrative consequences of losing Normandy required fundamental adjustments to governmental systems that had been designed to coordinate policies across the English Channel. The separation of English and Norman administrative apparatus necessitated the development of new institutional arrangements for governing territories that could no longer be administered as integrated units. The retention of Norman administrative personnel and procedures in England demonstrated the deep roots that continental governmental traditions had established during nearly a century and a half of Anglo-Norman rule. England might have lost Normandy, but it kept Norman methods of governance, fiscal crisis, and alienation. The fiscal crisis that developed during John's reign reflected both the extraordinary military expenses required for defending the Angevin territories and the king's inability to maintain the administrative efficiency that had characterized his father's government. The implementation of unprecedented taxation levels alienated both ecclesiastical and secular elites while failing to generate sufficient resources for successful military campaigns. The breakdown of consensual relationships between the crown and its major subjects created political tensions that would ultimately culminate in armed rebellion and constitutional crisis. John was squeezing his subjects dry, and they were beginning to resist. Papal interdict and submission. The interdict imposed by Pope Innocent III from 1208 to 1214 created a religious and political crisis that tested the fundamental assumptions of royal authority that had been established through Norman governmental traditions. The suspension of religious services throughout England challenged royal legitimacy while providing focal points for opposition to John's policies. The king's eventual submission to papal authority in 1213 represented a dramatic reversal of the royal supremacy over ecclesiastical affairs that had been asserted by Norman rulers since the conquest. John had bent the knee, not just to the Pope, but to political reality. The Battle of Bouvines. The military failures that culminated in the Battle of Bouvines in July 1214 demonstrated the collapse of John's continental ambitions, while creating domestic political conditions that made continued royal autocracy impossible. The defeat of the coalition forces led by John's allies ended realistic hopes for recovering the lost Anjuvin territories, while exposing the futility of the king's military and diplomatic strategies. The enormous costs of these unsuccessful campaigns, combined with their complete failure to achieve strategic objectives, created irresistible pressure for fundamental changes in the relationship between royal authority and baronial consent. The baronial rebellion that began in early 1215 represented the culmination of grievances that had accumulated throughout John's reign, focusing on specific administrative and legal practices that violated established customs and reasonable expectations of royal behavior. The rebels' demands addressed systematic abuses of royal authority, including arbitrary taxation, manipulation of legal procedures, and violations of feudal customs that had provided stability and predictability to the relationship between the crown and its subjects. The formulation of these grievances into specific constitutional demands demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of governmental principles that had developed through exposure to Norman administrative practices. June 1215. The negotiations at Runnymede in June 1215 created a constitutional framework that attempted to balance royal authority with baronial rights through the establishment of specific limitations on monarchical power. Magna Carta represented both a conservative attempt to restore traditional relationships and a revolutionary assertion of constitutional principles that would influence political development for centuries. The document's provisions address specific abuses while establishing general principles of governmental accountability that transcended immediate political circumstances. This was more than a peace treaty. It was a constitutional revolution. Legal principles and royal limits. The legal principles established in Magna Carta built upon foundations created through decades of Norman judicial innovation, while asserting limitations on royal authority that challenged fundamental assumptions of monarchical supremacy. The guarantee that justice would not be sold, denied, or delayed represented a direct response to John's manipulation of legal procedures. The provisions requiring due process of law established procedural protections that drew upon earlier legal developments. The assertion that the king was subject to law rather than above it represented a constitutional principle that would reshape concepts of royal authority throughout the medieval period, through the centuries to modern constitutional democracy. The flowering of Norman culture. The constitutional crisis that culminated in Magna Carta marked not merely a political watershed, but also coincided with the full flowering of Norman cultural and architectural achievement across their diverse territories. While political tensions dominated the relationship between crown and nobility, the underlying prosperity and administrative sophistication of Norman rule had created conditions that fostered unprecedented artistic and intellectual development. The wealth generated through efficient taxation, expanding trade networks, and systematic exploitation of agricultural resources provided Norman patrons with the financial means to commission ambitious architectural projects and support scholarly activities that would fundamentally transform European cultural development. Norman Romanesque architecture. The emergence of Norman Romanesque architecture represented perhaps the most visible manifestation of Norman cultural achievement, as massive stone structures rose throughout their territories to proclaim both divine glory and earthly power. The architectural revolution began in Normandy itself, where the great abbey churches of Caen established design principles that would influence construction throughout the Norman world. The Abbey Church of Saint Etienne, begun around 1060 under the patronage of William the Conqueror, demonstrated the sophisticated engineering capabilities that Norman builders had developed through their experience in castle construction, while incorporating decorative elements that reflected the cosmopolitan influences flowing through Norman territories. Innovation at Caen. The architectural innovations pioneered at Caen combined structural advances with aesthetic refinements that created a distinctly Norman interpretation of Romanesque design. The massive western towers, rising over 250 feet above the surrounding countryside, employed advanced construction techniques that distributed enormous structural loads through carefully calculated stone coursing and buttressing systems. The interior elevation, with its three-story arrangement of arcade, gallery, and clerestory, created vertical emphasis that drew the eye upward while providing practical solutions for supporting the stone vaulting that covered the nave. The integration of decorative sculpture with structural elements demonstrated the sophisticated artistic sensibilities that had developed within Norman patronage networks. International influence. The construction techniques employed at Saint-Étienne reflected the international character of Norman building projects, as master masons from across Europe contributed specialized knowledge to the ambitious undertaking. The precise stone cutting required for the complex geometric patterns that decorated the church's facades drew upon traditions developed in the Loire Valley, while the engineering solutions for supporting the massive stone vaults incorporated innovations learned from Lombard builders working in northern Italy. The systematic organization of construction crews and the standardization of building components enabled the rapid completion of major sections, while maintaining consistent quality throughout the enormous structure. Durham Cathedral. Norman power in stone. The architectural principles established at Caen were rapidly transmitted throughout the Norman territories, creating a coherent stylistic tradition that adapted to local conditions while maintaining recognizable characteristics. In England, the construction of Durham Cathedral, begun in 93, represented the most ambitious application of Norman Romanesque principles to an English setting. The cathedral's innovative ribbed vaulting system, among the earliest successful implementations of this technique in Europe, demonstrated the continued evolution of Norman architectural expertise through practical experimentation and technical innovation. Durham's strategic significance. Durham Cathedral's architectural significance extended far beyond its role as a religious center. The building represented a comprehensive statement of Norman cultural authority in northern England. The cathedral's massive scale, with its nave extending over 400 feet in length and its central tower rising nearly 220 feet above the river Wear, created an imposing presence that dominated the surrounding landscape for miles in every direction. The building's strategic location, atop a dramatic bend in the river, provided natural defenses that complemented its role as the seat of the prince-bishops who governed the turbulent northern frontier. Decorative innovation. The decorative program at Durham demonstrated the sophisticated artistic sensibilities that had developed within Norman cultural circles, as sculptors and craftsmen created ornamental schemes that combined traditional Romanesque motifs with innovations that reflected the multicultural influences flowing through Norman territories. The famous chevron patterns that decorated the cathedral's arches and columns represented distinctive Norman contributions to Romanesque ornamentation, while the carved capitals and doorway sculptures incorporated elements drawn from Byzantine and Celtic artistic traditions encountered through Norman expansion across Europe and the Mediterranean. Engineering excellence. The engineering achievements represented by Durham's stone vaulting system required mathematical calculations and structural understanding that demonstrated the high level of technical education available within Norman architectural circles. The successful implementation of ribbed vaults over such enormous spans necessitated precise calculations of load distribution and thrust patterns that pushed contemporary engineering knowledge to its limits. The cathedral's builders employed innovative construction techniques, including the use of pointed arches to reduce lateral thrust and the systematic placement of buttressing elements to channel structural forces safely to the ground. Norman Sicily. The ultimate synthesis. In Sicily, Norman architectural achievement reached its most sophisticated expression through the creation of buildings that synthesized Western European, Byzantine, and Islamic design traditions into unique architectural statements. The Palatine Chapel in Palermo, constructed during the reign of Roger II, represented the culmination of Norman cultural synthesis. The building combined structural techniques learned from European Romanesque traditions with decorative programs that drew upon the artistic heritage of the Mediterranean world. The Palatine Chapel, a multicultural masterpiece. The chapel's wooden ceiling, decorated with intricate geometric patterns derived from Islamic art, supported stone arches decorated with Byzantine mosaics that depicted Christian religious scenes in artistic styles that reflected centuries of Eastern Christian tradition. The architectural program of the Palatine Chapel demonstrated the sophisticated cultural policies that Norman rulers had developed for governing their diverse subjects. The building served simultaneously as a statement of Christian royal authority and an acknowledgement of the artistic achievements of non-Christian traditions. The integration of Arabic inscriptions into the decorative scheme, praising the Norman king in the language of his Muslim subjects, reflected the pragmatic approach to cultural diversity that had enabled Norman success in governing multicultural territories. The employment of Muslim craftsmen to create Christian religious art represented a level of cultural tolerance and artistic sophistication that had few parallels in medieval Europe. Montreal. The final flowering. The construction of Montreal Cathedral, begun under William II in the 1000, represented the final flowering of Norman architectural achievement in Sicily. The massive church combined the structural grandeur of Northern European Romanesque design with the decorative richness of Byzantine and Islamic artistic traditions. The cathedral's bronze doors, cast by Bonanno Pisano, incorporated sculptural programs that depicted biblical scenes in artistic styles that reflected the cosmopolitan influences available to Norman patrons. The extensive mosaic decorations that covered the interior walls represented one of the largest and most sophisticated decorative schemes of the medieval period, requiring the labor of craftsmen trained in Constantinople and the expenditure of enormous quantities of gold and precious materials. Architectural influence and legacy. The architectural innovations developed in Norman territories influenced construction throughout Europe. The distinctive characteristics of Norman Romanesque design were transmitted through the networks of religious and secular contacts that connected Norman rulers with their contemporaries across the continent. The pointed arches and ribbed vaulting systems pioneered in Norman churches provided technical foundations for the Gothic architectural revolution that would transform European building practices during the 13th century. The decorative motifs developed in Norman buildings, particularly the geometric patterns and sculptural programs created in Sicily, influenced artistic development throughout the Mediterranean world. Literary achievement and patronage. The literary achievements of Norman courts reflected the cosmopolitan character of Norman society, as patrons supported writers and scholars who created works that drew upon diverse cultural traditions while serving the political and social needs of Norman elites. The development of vernacular literature in Norman territories represented a significant departure from the Latin literary tradition that had dominated European intellectual life. Writers began creating works in the languages spoken by their audiences, rather than the scholarly language of the church and universities. Chronicles and history. The patronage of chroniclers represented one of the most significant Norman contributions to medieval historical writing. Rulers throughout the Norman territories commissioned detailed accounts of their achievements that preserved invaluable information about political, military, and cultural developments. Orderic Vitalis, writing in the early 12th century at the monastery of Saint Evroul, created the most comprehensive account of Norman expansion and development. Drawing upon his personal observations and extensive documentary sources, he produced a historical narrative that combined scholarly rigor with literary sophistication. His ecclesiastical history provided detailed accounts of Norman conquest and administration that demonstrated both the complexity of Norman society and the sophisticated intellectual culture that had developed within Norman religious institutions. Geofry of Monmouth. History as literature. Geofry of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, completed around 1136, represented a different approach to historical writing, one that emphasized literary artistry and political propaganda rather than documentary accuracy. Geoffrey's creative reconstruction of British history, including his influential account of King Arthur's reign, provided Norman rulers with historical precedents that legitimized their authority while creating literary traditions that would influence European culture for centuries. The work's enormous popularity throughout medieval Europe demonstrated the effectiveness of Norman cultural patronage in creating and disseminating literary works that serve both artistic and political purposes. Truth and legend merged in Geoffrey's pages, and the legends proved more powerful than the truth. Vernacular literature and epic poetry. The development of vernacular literature in Norman territories reflected both the practical needs of governing diverse populations and the cultural sophistication of Norman courts that attracted writers and scholars from across Europe. The chanson de geste tradition that flourished under Norman patronage created epic narratives that celebrated martial virtues while providing entertainment for aristocratic audiences. The Song of Roland, though originating in earlier oral traditions, achieved its definitive form through the patronage of Norman nobles who appreciated its themes of feudal loyalty and Christian warfare against Muslim enemies. The poem became a mirror in which Norman knights could see their idealized selves reflected. Sicilian intellectual achievement. The literary culture that developed in Norman Sicily represented the most sophisticated synthesis of diverse intellectual traditions achieved anywhere in medieval Europe. The court at Palermo attracted scholars, translators, and writers who worked with texts in Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew. The translation movement that flourished under Norman patronage made available to Western European scholars classical and Islamic texts that had been unknown or lost in Latin Europe, contributing significantly to the intellectual developments of the 12th century Renaissance. The preservation and transmission of classical texts through Norman scholarly networks provided foundations for the revival of Aristotelian philosophy and the development of scholastic theology that would transform European intellectual life. The Norman role in the Renaissance of the 12th century. The Norman role in the 12th century Renaissance extended far beyond their territories. The wealth and political connections of Norman rulers enabled them to support scholarly activities that influenced intellectual development throughout Europe. The patronage of cathedral schools and emerging universities created educational institutions that attracted students from across the continent, while the systematic collection and copying of manuscripts preserved classical and contemporary texts that might otherwise have been lost. The establishment of libraries in Norman religious institutions provided scholars with access to diverse textual traditions that facilitated the comparative studies and synthetic approaches that characterized Renaissance intellectual culture. Sicily, crossroads of knowledge. The integration of Arab scholarship into European intellectual life occurred most extensively in Norman Sicily, where the political stability and cultural tolerance of Norman rule created conditions that enabled sustained intellectual exchange between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars. The court of Roger attracted Muslim intellectuals fleeing political instability in North Africa and Spain, while Byzantine scholars fleeing the disruptions of the Crusades found refuge and patronage in Norman territories. The resulting concentration of diverse scholarly traditions created an intellectual environment that had no parallel in medieval Europe. This was a place where a Jewish scholar might translate an Arabic text into Latin for a Christian patron, a level of collaboration unthinkable in most of medieval Christendom. Scientific and mathematical knowledge. The astronomical and mathematical knowledge preserved in Arabic texts was transmitted to European scholars through translation projects sponsored by Norman patrons, contributing to advances in natural philosophy and practical sciences that would influence European development for centuries. The translation of Ptolemy's Almagest and other classical scientific texts provided European scholars with sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge that had been lost in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. The preservation of medical texts, including the works of Galen and Islamic medical authorities, contributed to advances in medical knowledge that improved healthcare throughout Norman territories. Artistic innovation and synthesis. The artistic innovations developed in Norman territories reflected the diverse cultural influences that flowed through their extensive trade networks and political connections. Craftsmen and artists working under Norman patronage created objects that synthesized artistic traditions from across Europe and the Mediterranean. The manuscript illumination produced in Norman scriptoria demonstrated sophisticated artistic techniques that combined Northern European linear traditions with Byzantine coloristic approaches and Islamic geometric patterns. The resulting artistic style influenced manuscript production throughout Europe, while creating distinctive regional traditions that reflected the unique cultural synthesis achieved in Norman territories. Metalwork and luxury arts. The metalwork produced in Norman workshops represented some of the finest artistic achievements of the medieval period. Craftsmen working with precious metals created objects that combined technical virtuosity with aesthetic sophistication. The bronze doors created for Norman churches incorporated sculptural programs that rivaled the finest stone carving of the period, while the liturgical objects produced for Norman religious institutions demonstrated mastery of complex metallurgical techniques that had been learned from Byzantine and Islamic craftsmen. The secular metalwork produced for Norman nobles, including weapons, jewelry, and household objects, reflected the wealth and artistic sophistication of Norman society. Textile production and trade. The textile production that flourished under Norman patronage created luxury fabrics that were prized throughout Europe. Norman workshops developed weaving techniques that incorporated silk threads and decorative patterns derived from Byzantine and Islamic traditions. The distinctive Norman approach to textile design combined Northern European structural techniques with Mediterranean decorative traditions to create fabrics that were both technically superior and aesthetically sophisticated. The export of Norman textiles provided significant revenues while spreading Norman artistic influence throughout European markets. The decorative arts. The decorative arts that developed in Norman territories demonstrated the sophisticated cultural synthesis that characterized Norman society. Craftsmen working in various media created objects that reflected the diverse artistic traditions encountered through Norman expansion and trade. The ivory carving produced in Norman workshops combined Northern European figural traditions with Byzantine decorative techniques to create objects that served both religious and secular purposes. The enamel work produced in Norman territories incorporated technical innovations learned from Byzantine craftsmen while developing distinctive stylistic characteristics that influenced decorative arts production throughout Europe. Cultural achievement. A summary. The cultural achievements of Norman society during the period from 1050 to 1250 represented the culmination of processes that had begun with the settlement of Normandy in the early 10th century. Successive generations of Norman rulers had created conditions that fostered artistic and intellectual development, while maintaining the military and administrative effectiveness that enabled their continued political success. The sophisticated synthesis of diverse cultural traditions achieved in Norman territories provided models for cultural development that influenced European civilization for centuries, while the specific artistic and intellectual innovations created under Norman patronage contributed directly to the broader cultural transformations that characterized the high medieval period. The decline of Norman power. The cultural flowering that had characterized Norman territories during the high medieval period occurred against a backdrop of mounting political pressures that would ultimately terminate the independent existence of Norman states across Europe. While Norman architects continued constructing magnificent cathedrals and Norman scholars preserved classical texts in monastery libraries, the territorial foundations of Norman power faced systematic erosion from resurgent monarchies that possessed superior resources and more centralized administrative systems. The loss of Normandy to Philip Augustus in 1204 marked the beginning of a process that would culminate 64 years later with the Angevin conquest of Sicily, effectively ending the era of independent Norman political entities that had dominated European affairs for over 3 centuries. The French conquest of Normandy. Military analysis. The military campaigns that led to the loss of Normandy revealed fundamental weaknesses in the defensive systems that had protected the duchy since its establishment in 911. Philip Augustus of France had spent decades systematically preparing for the conquest of Norman territories, constructing an extensive network of royal fortifications along the Norman frontier while developing siege techniques specifically designed to reduce the massive stone castles that formed the backbone of Norman defensive strategy. The French king's methodical approach contrasted sharply with the haphazard defensive preparations undertaken by John Lackland, whose attention was divided between English domestic politics, continental military campaigns, and personal conflicts with his own nobility. The Siege of Chateau Gauyar. A turning point. The siege of Chateau Gauyar, beginning in August 1203, demonstrated both the sophistication of French military engineering and the inadequacy of Norman responses to systematic siege warfare conducted with unlimited resources and professional expertise. Philip Augustus invested the fortress with forces numbering over 10,000 men, including specialized siege engineers trained in the latest techniques for reducing stone fortifications. The French siege works included massive earthen ramparts that protected attacking forces from defensive archery, while sophisticated mining operations targeted the castle's foundation stones with mathematical precision that reflected advances in military engineering developed through decades of practical experience. The defenders' impossible task. The defenders of Chateau Gauyar, commanded by Roger de Lacy, possessed extensive experience in siege warfare gained through campaigns in England and France. But they lacked the resources necessary for sustained resistance against the overwhelming French forces. The garrison numbered fewer than 200 knights and men-at-arms, supported by approximately 300 crossbowmen and infantry, creating impossible odds against the massive French army that surrounded the fortress. The systematic starvation of the garrison through complete blockade of supply routes demonstrated French logistical capabilities that far exceeded anything the Normans could deploy in their own defense. The psychological impact of defeat. The fall of Chateau Gauyar in March 1204 opened the Seine Valley to French advance, while eliminating the strongest defensive position protecting the approaches to Rouen. The psychological impact of the fortress's capture reverberated throughout Norman territories. The supposed impregnability of Richard the Lionheart's greatest architectural achievement had been definitively disproven through French siege techniques. The speed of the castle's reduction, accomplished in less than 8 months despite its formidable defenses, demonstrated that traditional Norman military advantages had been neutralized through French innovations in siege warfare and military organization. The defection of the Norman nobility. The systematic defection of Norman nobles to Philip Augustus during 1204 reflected both practical calculations of military advantage and deeper dissatisfaction with John's leadership that had been building throughout his reign. The Norman aristocracy had maintained loyalty to the Anjuvin dynasty through decades of military campaigns and administrative innovations. But John's arbitrary governance and military incompetence had eroded the bonds of feudal obligation that connected Norman nobles to their English overlords. The French king's generous terms for submission, which guaranteed existing property rights and feudal privileges, provided attractive alternatives to continued resistance under increasingly hopeless circumstances. The fall of Rouen. The surrender of Rouen in June 1204 marked the effective end of Norman resistance, as the duchy's capital submitted without siege after its garrison recognized the futility of opposing the overwhelming French forces that had systematically reduced every major stronghold along the Seine. The ceremonial entry of Philip Augustus into Rouen represented the culmination of Capetian ambitions that had been frustrated for over a century by Norman military superiority and administrative efficiency. The French king's treatment of the surrendered city demonstrated both magnanimity toward former enemies and shrewd political calculation designed to encourage submission throughout the remaining Norman territories. Administrative integration into France. The administrative integration of Normandy into the Capetian kingdom required careful balance between French royal authority and Norman institutional traditions that had developed sophisticated governmental procedures over nearly 3 centuries. Philip Augustus recognized that the duchy's economic prosperity and military potential depended upon maintaining the administrative systems that had made Norman governance so effective, while ensuring that these institutions served French rather than English interests. The retention of existing Norman officials and legal procedures facilitated the transition to French rule, while preserving the governmental expertise that had made the duchy valuable to its conquerors. Legal continuity and change. The preservation of Norman customary law within the French royal administration represented one of the most significant aspects of the territorial integration. Philip Augustus and his successors recognized that Norman legal traditions had developed sophisticated solutions to problems of governance that could benefit the broader French kingdom. The Norman emphasis on written records and standardized procedures provided models for administrative reforms that would eventually transform French governmental practices throughout the realm. The continuation of Norman legal institutions under French sovereignty created precedents for regional autonomy within centralized monarchy that would influence French constitutional development for centuries. Economic policy in conquered Normandy. The economic policies implemented by French administrators in conquered Norman territories demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the sources of Norman prosperity and the importance of maintaining commercial networks that generated substantial royal revenues. The protection of Norman merchants and the continuation of existing trade relationships ensured that the duchy's integration into the French kingdom enhanced rather than disrupted the commercial activities that had made Normandy one of the wealthiest regions of medieval Europe. The systematic exploitation of Norman agricultural resources through existing administrative mechanisms provided French royal treasuries with revenues that financed continued military campaigns and administrative expansion. The transformation of Norman identity. The transformation of Norman identity following the loss of political independence required fundamental adjustments to concepts of cultural and social allegiance that had been shaped by centuries of autonomous development. The Norman nobility faced difficult choices between maintaining connections to English territories and accepting integration into French aristocratic society, with different families pursuing varying strategies based on their particular circumstances and interests. The gradual adoption of French cultural practices and political allegiances occurred through processes of intermarriage, land exchange, and administrative service that created new forms of regional identity within the broader French kingdom. French military innovation and Norman territories. The military innovations that had enabled French conquest of Normandy were systematically applied to other Norman territories, as Philip Augustus and his successors recognized that traditional Norman defensive advantages could be overcome through superior resources and professional military organization. The siege techniques perfected during the Norman campaigns were employed against English castles during subsequent French raids across the Channel, while the administrative methods developed for governing conquered Norman territories provided models for French expansion into other regions. The French success in Normandy demonstrated that even the most sophisticated medieval defensive systems could be overcome through systematic application of superior resources and professional expertise. Ecclesiastical consequences. The ecclesiastical consequences of Norman territorial losses created complex jurisdictional questions that required careful negotiation between French royal authority and papal oversight of church affairs. The Norman Church had developed distinctive institutional characteristics through centuries of ducal patronage and administrative integration, creating ecclesiastical structures that differed significantly from French church organization. The integration of Norman religious institutions into the French ecclesiastical hierarchy required diplomatic negotiations that balanced papal concerns about church autonomy with French royal determination to control ecclesiastical appointments and revenues within conquered territories. Cultural continuity despite political change. The cultural continuity that persisted despite political transformation demonstrated the deep roots that Norman traditions had established throughout their territories. Architectural styles, literary traditions, and artistic practices continued to influence regional development long after the loss of political independence. The completion of major Norman architectural projects under French patronage illustrated the continuing vitality of Norman cultural traditions, while the preservation of Norman historical chronicles and literary works ensured that the memory of Norman achievements would survive the end of their political autonomy. The gradual evolution of regional identity from Norman independence to French provincial status created new forms of cultural expression that synthesized Norman traditions with French royal culture. England after Normandy, a new identity. In England, the loss of Normandy created fundamental changes in the character of royal government and aristocratic society. As the separation from continental territories forced English nobles to choose between their Norman and English interests. The confiscation of Norman estates belonging to English nobles who refused to submit to French authority eliminated the cross-channel landholding that had characterized Anglo-Norman society since 1066. The resulting concentration of English noble interests within the kingdom created new political dynamics that would ultimately contribute to the constitutional conflicts that produced Magna Carta and subsequent limitations on royal authority. Administrative adaptation in England. The administrative adaptations required by the loss of Normandy demonstrated both the flexibility and limitations of Norman governmental systems, as English royal officials struggled to maintain effective administration without the continental resources and expertise that had supported Angevin government. The development of purely English administrative procedures required innovations that drew upon Norman traditions while adapting to the reduced territorial scope and different political circumstances of the post-1204 kingdom. The creation of new institutional arrangements for governing England as an island kingdom, rather than part of a continental empire, represented significant administrative achievements that built upon Norman governmental foundations. The crisis in Sicily. A different challenge. Meanwhile, in Sicily, the Norman kingdom faced different but equally serious challenges to its continued independence. The death of Frederick II in 1250 created a succession crisis that exposed the fundamental weaknesses of Norman political institutions when confronted by determined external pressure. The Sicilian Norman state had achieved remarkable cultural and administrative sophistication during the 12th and early 13th centuries, but its strategic position in the Mediterranean made it a target for Papal, French, and Aragonese ambitions that would ultimately prove impossible to resist with the limited resources available to the island kingdom. Papal opposition and French ambition. The papal campaign against the Hohenstaufen dynasty that had ruled Norman Sicily since the marriage of Henry VI to Constance of Hauteville created opportunities for French intervention that would ultimately terminate Norman independence in southern Italy. Pope Innocent IV's determination to eliminate German influence from the Italian peninsula led to systematic papal support for French claims to the Sicilian throne, despite the fact that such intervention would destroy the unique multicultural synthesis that had made Norman Sicily one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated kingdoms. Charles of Anjou and the French conquest. The military campaigns that brought Charles of Anjou to Sicily in 1266 employed the same systematic approach to siege warfare and territorial conquest that had proven successful in Normandy. French forces possessed superior resources and professional organization that overwhelmed the defensive capabilities available to the last Norman rulers. The Battle of Benevento in February 1266 demonstrated the continued effectiveness of French heavy cavalry against traditional Norman military formations, while the systematic reduction of Sicilian strongholds illustrated French mastery of siege techniques that had been perfected through decades of continental warfare. The death of Manfred and Norman resistance. The death of Manfred of Sicily at Benevento eliminated the last effective Norman resistance to French conquest. The Sicilian nobility recognized the futility of continued opposition to Charles of Anjou's overwhelming military advantages. The systematic execution or exile of Norman nobles who had supported Manfred's cause eliminated the aristocratic leadership that had maintained Norman political identity in Sicily for over 2 centuries. The replacement of Norman administrative personnel with French officials terminated the governmental traditions that had made Sicilian administration a model for medieval Europe. The execution of Conradin. The end of an era. The final destruction of Norman political independence occurred with the execution of Conradin of Hohenstaufen in Naples in October 1268. Charles of Anjou eliminated the last potential claimant to Norman Sicily, who possessed both legitimate hereditary rights and the military capability to challenge French rule. The public execution of the 16-year-old prince demonstrated French determination to prevent any revival of Norman political aspirations, while serving as a warning to potential supporters of Norman restoration. The brutal elimination of the Hohenstaufen line marked the definitive end of the Norman political tradition that had shaped Mediterranean affairs for over 2 centuries. Transformation of identity. England and France. The transformation of Norman identity from ruling elite to regional aristocracy occurred through processes that varied significantly between England and France, reflecting the different political circumstances and cultural environments that Norman nobles encountered in their respective kingdoms. In England, The gradual adoption of English cultural practices and political allegiances created new forms of aristocratic identity that retained certain Norman characteristics while adapting to the requirements of English royal service. The development of English common law traditions that built upon Norman legal foundations demonstrated the continuing influence of Norman institutional innovations long after the loss of political independence. Integration into French aristocracy. In France, the integration of Norman nobles into the broader French aristocracy occurred through marriages, land exchanges, and administrative service that gradually eroded distinctive Norman identity, while preserving certain regional characteristics. The continued importance of Norman territories within the French kingdom ensured that former Norman nobles retained significant political influence, though exercised within French rather than Norman institutional frameworks. The preservation of Norman architectural and cultural traditions within French royal patronage demonstrated the continuing value placed on Norman achievements even after their political subjugation. Economic consequences of lost independence. The economic consequences of the end of Norman independence varied considerably between different regions, reflecting the diverse economic foundations that had supported Norman political power. The integration of Normandy into the French kingdom enhanced the duchy's commercial prospects through access to broader French markets and royal protection of trade networks, while the destruction of Sicilian Norman independence disrupted Mediterranean commercial relationships that had generated substantial revenues for centuries. The different economic outcomes reflected both the varying circumstances of Norman territorial losses and the different policies pursued by conquering powers toward their newly acquired territories. The institutional legacy. The institutional legacy of Norman government continued to influence European political development long after the end of Norman independence. The administrative innovations and legal traditions developed in Norman territories provided models for governmental reform throughout medieval Europe. The systematic record-keeping procedures pioneered in Norman administrations influenced the development of royal bureaucracies in France and England, while Norman legal traditions contributed to the evolution of common law systems that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world. The preservation of Norman governmental expertise through the service of former Norman officials in French and English administrations ensured that Norman institutional innovations continued to shape European political development well into the 13th and 14th century. Norman contributions to medieval monarchy. The Norman contribution to the development of medieval monarchy represented perhaps their most enduring political legacy. The administrative systems they had perfected provided blueprints for centralized royal authority that would be adopted and adapted throughout Europe. The English royal administration that emerged during the reigns of Henry II and his successors demonstrated the effectiveness of Norman bureaucratic innovations in creating governmental institutions capable of exercising consistent authority over extensive territories. The development of the Chancery, Exchequer, and royal courts under Norman influence established administrative frameworks that enabled English kings to maintain effective control over their realm while providing efficient mechanisms for revenue collection and judicial administration. From personal to institutional rule. The systematic approach to royal administration that characterized Norman government differed fundamentally from the personal, peripatetic governance that had characterized earlier medieval kingship. Norman rulers had developed sophisticated bureaucratic institutions that could function effectively even during royal absences, creating governmental continuity that transcended individual monarchs and their personal capabilities. The establishment of permanent administrative offices staffed by professional clerks and officials provided institutional memory and procedural consistency that enhanced governmental efficiency while reducing dependence on royal presence for routine administrative functions. Revenue collection and the Domesday legacy. The innovations in royal revenue collection pioneered in Norman territories revolutionized medieval fiscal administration through the development of systematic taxation procedures and comprehensive record-keeping that enabled more accurate assessment of royal resources. The Domesday Book, compiled under William the Conqueror's direction, represented the most ambitious administrative undertaking of its era. creating detailed records of landholding and population that provided foundations for efficient taxation and military recruitment. The survey's methodology, involving systematic data collection by royal commissioners and cross-referencing of information from multiple sources, established precedents for governmental record-keeping that influenced administrative practices throughout medieval Europe. Financial documentation and accountability. The pipe rolls that documented annual exchequer accounts under Norman administration created unprecedented transparency in royal financial management, while providing detailed records of governmental revenues and expenditures that enabled more effective fiscal planning. These administrative records, maintained continuously from the early 12th century, represented innovations in governmental accountability that had no parallels in contemporary European administrations. The systematic documentation of royal finances enabled Norman and Anjuvin rulers to make informed decisions about military campaigns, architectural projects, and administrative expansion based on accurate knowledge of available resources. Legal innovation and common law. The legal innovations introduced by Norman rulers fundamentally transformed concepts of royal justice and legal procedure throughout medieval Europe. The development of royal courts with standardized procedures provided alternatives to local and ecclesiastical jurisdictions that had previously dominated legal administration. The creation of common law traditions under Henry II established legal principles that emphasized royal authority while providing consistent procedures for resolving disputes that transcended local customs and jurisdictions. The power of written law. The systematic codification of legal procedures through the development of standardized rights and court records created institutional frameworks for dispensing justice that influenced legal development throughout the English-speaking world. The Norman approach to legal administration emphasized written documentation and procedural consistency in ways that distinguished their judicial systems from the oral traditions and customary practices that characterized most medieval legal institutions. The requirement that legal proceedings be recorded in writing created archives of judicial decisions that provided precedents for future cases, while ensuring that legal procedures could be reviewed and standardized across different jurisdictions. Professional legal personnel. The development of professional legal personnel, trained in Norman legal traditions, created cadres of judges and administrators, whose expertise could be deployed throughout royal territories to ensure consistent application of legal principles. This professionalization of law represented a fundamental shift in medieval governance, from justice dispensed by local lords based on custom and personal judgment to systematic legal procedures administered by trained professionals applying consistent principles. Centralized royal authority. The concept of centralized royal authority that emerged from Norman governmental practice represented a fundamental departure from the decentralized political structures that had characterized early medieval Europe. Norman rulers had developed institutional mechanisms for extending royal authority into local communities while maintaining effective oversight of regional administrators and feudal vassals. The creation of circuit courts that brought royal justice directly to local populations demonstrated Norman understanding of the importance of making royal authority visible and accessible throughout their territories. The systematic rotation of royal officials between different administrative positions prevented the development of local power bases that might challenge royal authority, while ensuring that governmental expertise was distributed throughout the administrative hierarchy. Military innovation. Cavalry and siege warfare. The military innovations developed by Norman commanders during their campaigns across Europe fundamentally transformed medieval warfare through the refinement of heavy cavalry tactics and the systematic development of siege warfare capabilities. The Norman emphasis on coordinated cavalry charges, supported by infantry and archery units, created tactical systems that proved devastatingly effective against diverse enemies, from Anglo-Saxon shield walls to Byzantine cataphracts. The standardization of equipment and training procedures among Norman military units enabled rapid deployment of effective fighting forces while maintaining tactical flexibility that could adapt to varying battlefield conditions. Evolution of cavalry tactics. The evolution of Norman cavalry tactics reflected their practical experience in diverse military environments, as commanders adapted traditional Frankish heavy cavalry methods to meet the challenges posed by different enemies and terrain conditions. The development of disciplined retreat, procedures that allowed Norman cavalry units to withdraw from unsuccessful charges and reorganize for renewed attacks, represented significant tactical innovations that enhanced battlefield survivability while maintaining offensive survivability. The integration of feigned retreat tactics into Norman battle plans demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare and enemy behavior that enabled smaller Norman forces to defeat numerically superior opponents. The Norman approach to siege warfare represented perhaps their most significant military innovation, as they developed systematic procedures for reducing fortified positions that combined traditional assault techniques with innovative engineering solutions. The construction of siege towers, battering rams, and catapults under Norman direction employed mathematical principles and engineering expertise that reflected the high level of technical education available within Norman military circles. The systematic investment of enemy fortifications through the construction of extensive earthworks and the coordination of multiple assault techniques demonstrated organizational capabilities that enabled Norman forces to capture supposedly impregnable strongholds throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Castle building. Power made stone. The castle fortification techniques perfected by Norman builders fundamentally transformed European military architecture through the development of integrated defensive systems that combined passive fortification with active defense capabilities. The evolution from wooden motte and bailey structures to sophisticated stone castles occurred rapidly under Norman influence, driven by practical experience in siege warfare and the availability of skilled craftsmen and abundant financial resources. The development of concentric defensive walls, flanking towers, and elaborate gatehouse complexes created fortifications that could withstand prolonged siege while providing secure bases for offensive operations against enemy territories. Castles as centers of power. Norman innovations in castle design reflected their understanding of the multiple functions that fortifications served in medieval society. Castles provided not only military defense, but also administrative centers, economic hubs, and symbols of political authority. The integration of residential accommodations with defensive features created fortress palaces that could house substantial garrisons while providing suitable venues for royal courts and feudal assemblies. The systematic placement of castles at strategic river crossings, mountain passes, and coastal harbors created integrated defensive networks that controlled regional transportation and communication while providing secure supply bases for military campaigns. Influencing all of Europe. The architectural innovations pioneered in Norman castle construction influenced civilian building throughout Europe, as techniques developed for military purposes were adapted for ecclesiastical and residential construction. The massive stone construction methods perfected in Norman keeps provided foundations for the development of Gothic architectural traditions that would transform European church architecture during the 13th century. The engineering solutions developed for supporting enormous stone structures over wide spans contributed to advances in structural engineering that enabled the construction of increasingly ambitious architectural projects throughout medieval Europe. Facilitating cultural exchange. The Norman role in facilitating cultural exchange between Northern and Southern Europe represented one of their most significant contributions to medieval intellectual development. The extensive territorial holdings of Norman rulers created communication networks that linked diverse cultural regions, while providing secure transportation routes for merchants, scholars, and pilgrims traveling between different parts of Europe. The multicultural character of Norman society, particularly in Sicily, created environments where scholars and artists from different cultural backgrounds could interact and collaborate on intellectual and artistic projects that synthesized diverse traditions. The Great Translation Movement. The translation movement that flourished under Norman patronage made available to European scholars classical texts and Islamic scientific works that had been unknown or lost in Latin Europe. The systematic preservation and copying of manuscripts in Norman scriptoria created libraries that served as repositories of classical learning, while providing resources for scholarly research and educational activities. The Norman support for cathedral schools and emerging universities created educational institutions that attracted students from across Europe, while developing new approaches to teaching and learning that would influence European intellectual development for centuries. Architectural synthesis across three cultures. The architectural synthesis achieved in Norman territories, particularly in Sicily, demonstrated the possibility of creating artistic traditions that incorporated diverse cultural influences while maintaining coherent aesthetic principles. The integration of Byzantine mosaics, Islamic geometric patterns, and Western European structural techniques in Norman buildings created architectural styles that had no parallels elsewhere in medieval Europe. The employment of craftsmen from different cultural backgrounds in Norman construction projects facilitated the transmission of technical knowledge and artistic techniques that influenced building practices throughout the Mediterranean world. Administrative models for a changing Europe. The administrative practices developed in Norman territories provided models for governmental efficiency that were adopted and adapted throughout medieval Europe. The Norman emphasis on written documentation and systematic record-keeping created administrative procedures that enhanced governmental accountability while providing institutional memory that enabled more effective policy implementation. The development of professional administrative cadres trained in Norman governmental methods created pools of expertise that could be deployed to establish efficient administrations in newly conquered territories or to reform existing governmental institutions. Managing diversity. The Norman way. The Norman approach to governing diverse populations demonstrated practical solutions to problems of cultural and religious diversity that challenged medieval rulers throughout Europe. The policies developed in Norman Sicily for accommodating Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities within a unified political framework provided precedents for religious tolerance and cultural accommodation that influenced governmental practices in other multicultural societies. The systematic preservation of existing legal traditions and administrative procedures in conquered territories demonstrated Norman understanding of the importance of maintaining social stability while establishing political control. Commerce and prosperity. The commercial policies implemented in Norman territories created economic frameworks that facilitated long-distance trade while generating substantial revenues for royal treasuries. The establishment of standardized weights, measures, and currency systems reduced transaction costs for merchants while enhancing the reliability of commercial exchanges. The protection of merchant caravans and the construction of secure harbors and markets created commercial infrastructure that supported economic development while demonstrating the economic benefits of effective governmental administration. The spread of Norman legal traditions. The influence of Norman legal traditions on the development of common law systems extended far beyond the boundaries of Norman territories, as legal principles and procedures developed under Norman rule were transmitted throughout Europe through the service of Norman-trained legal personnel in foreign courts and administrations. The Norman emphasis on written legal procedures and systematic documentation of judicial decisions created legal traditions that emphasized precedent and procedural consistency in ways that distinguished common law systems from Roman law traditions that dominated much of continental Europe. Codifying custom into law. The codification of customary law that occurred in Norman territories provided models for legal reform that influenced governmental practices throughout medieval Europe. The systematic compilation of legal customs and their integration with royal legislation created comprehensive legal codes that balanced respect for traditional practices with the requirements of centralized governmental authority. The Norman approach to legal codification demonstrated methods for reconciling diverse legal traditions within unified political systems while maintaining the flexibility necessary for adapting legal procedures to changing social and economic conditions. Feudalism. Norman style. The Norman contribution to the development of feudal institutions represented sophisticated attempts to balance royal authority with aristocratic autonomy through the creation of mutual obligations and reciprocal relationships that provided stability and predictability to medieval political systems. The systematic definition of feudal obligations and the development of institutional mechanisms for resolving disputes between lords and vassals created frameworks for political organization that influenced European governmental development for centuries. The Norman approach to feudalism emphasized written documentation of feudal relationships and systematic enforcement of feudal obligations in ways that enhanced the effectiveness of feudal institutions while providing mechanisms for governmental oversight and control. Military service in the feudal system. The military service obligations imposed on feudal tenants in Norman territories created systematic frameworks for military recruitment that enabled rapid mobilization of substantial military forces while distributing the costs of military preparedness throughout the feudal hierarchy. The development of scutage systems that allowed monetary payments in lieu of personal military service provided royal treasuries with flexible resources for hiring professional soldiers while accommodating the changing military requirements of medieval warfare. The systematic documentation of military obligations and the establishment of procedures for enforcing military service created institutional frameworks that enhanced military effectiveness while maintaining feudal relationships. From political reality to historical memory. Yet, as the 14th century dawned, the political entities that had created these innovations had vanished from the map of Europe. The Norman states that had dominated medieval politics for 3 centuries existed now only in memory and in the institutional legacies they had bequeathed to their successors. This transformation from political reality to historical memory would prove as significant as the original Norman conquests, as later generations of chroniclers, scholars, and national mythmakers would reshape the Norman story to serve the ideological needs of emerging nation-states and evolving concepts of cultural identity. The Romanticization begins. The Romanticization of Norman achievements began almost immediately after the loss of Norman political independence, as chroniclers in England and France sought to explain the remarkable success of a relatively small group of warriors who had conquered and governed territories from the Scottish borders to the Mediterranean. The English chroniclers of the 13th and 14th centuries, writing in the aftermath of the loss of Normandy and the constitutional crises that followed, began to portray the Norman conquest not as a foreign invasion, but as a providential intervention that had brought superior governmental institutions and military prowess to an island kingdom that had been weakened by Anglo-Saxon divisions and Danish raids. Mathew Paris and Providential History. Mathew Paris, writing at St. Albans in the mid-13th century, exemplified this romanticizing tendency through his portrayal of William the Conqueror as a divinely appointed reformer whose victory at Hastings had rescued England from chaos and ineffective governance. Paris's historical narrative emphasized the administrative achievements of Norman rule, while minimizing the violence and displacement that had accompanied the conquest. His chronicle presented the Norman transformation of England as a necessary modernization that had elevated the kingdom from peripheral insignificance to European prominence, establishing interpretive frameworks that would influence English historical consciousness for centuries. Foundation myths and national destiny. The development of foundation myths in English national narratives during the later medieval period increasingly incorporated Norman achievements as essential elements of English identity rather than foreign impositions upon native traditions. The Brut chronicles that proliferated during the 14th and 15th centuries wove Norman conquest into broader narratives of English destiny that traced the kingdom's development from legendary Trojan origins through Roman occupation, Anglo-Saxon settlement, and Norman transformation. These mythological histories presented the Norman conquest as the culmination of England's evolution toward its destined role as a major European power, transforming foreign conquest into national fulfillment. French narratives of restoration. French chroniclers developed parallel but distinct romanticizing narratives that emphasized the Norman role in expanding French territorial control and spreading French cultural influence throughout Europe. The Grandes Chroniques de France, compiled during the 14th century under royal patronage, presented the conquest of Normandy by Philip Augustus as the restoration of rightful French authority over territories that had been temporarily alienated through Viking raids and subsequent political arrangements. These official histories portrayed Norman achievements as extensions of French royal power rather than independent accomplishments, creating interpretive frameworks that subordinated Norman identity to broader French national narratives. Epic poetry and chivalric romance. The literary traditions that emerged during the later medieval period further contributed to the romanticization of Norman achievements through the creation of epic narratives that celebrated Norman military prowess while transforming historical conquests into chivalric adventures. The chanson de geste tradition that had flourished under Norman patronage was adapted by later poets who emphasized the religious and cultural dimensions of Norman expansion while minimizing the political and economic motivations that had actually driven Norman conquests. These literary works presented Norman warriors as idealized Christian knights, whose conquests had advanced the cause of civilization and faith against barbarism and paganism. Arthur and the Normans. The Arthurian romances that proliferated during the 12th and 13th centuries incorporated Norman historical figures and events into mythological narratives that transformed specific military campaigns into timeless stories of heroic achievement. Geofry of Monmouth's influential History of the Kings of Britain had established precedents for this mythologizing approach by creating fictional genealogies that connected Norman rulers to legendary British kings, providing historical legitimacy for Norman rule while creating literary traditions that would influence European culture for centuries. The systematic incorporation of Norman achievements into Arthurian literature demonstrated the extent to which Norman conquests had captured the medieval imagination and provided source material for romantic literature that transcended historical accuracy. Renaissance rediscovery. The scholarly rediscovery of Norman history during the Renaissance reflected broader humanist interests in recovering and analyzing medieval historical sources, as scholars developed new methodological approaches to understanding the past that emphasize critical examination of documentary evidence, rather than acceptance of traditional narratives. The printing revolution of the 15th and 16th centuries made available to scholars numerous medieval chronicles and administrative records that had previously been accessible only in manuscript form, creating opportunities for comparative analysis and critical evaluation that revealed the complexity and sophistication of Norman governmental institutions. Critical historians emerge. Renaissance historians such as Polydore Vergil and William Camden approached Norman history with scholarly methodologies that emphasize documentary evidence and critical analysis rather than the moral and political purposes that had shaped medieval chronicles. Their historical works attempted to distinguish between reliable historical information and legendary material that had been incorporated into earlier narratives, creating more accurate accounts of Norman achievements, while identifying the sources of romanticizing myths that had developed during the later medieval period. These scholarly approaches established methodological foundations for modern historical research, while demonstrating the extent to which Norman history had been distorted through centuries of mythological interpretation. The antiquarian contribution. The antiquarian movement that flourished during the 16th and 17th centuries contributed significantly to the recovery of Norman historical sources through systematic efforts to locate, preserve, and publish medieval documents that provided detailed information about Norman governmental practices and cultural achievements. Scholars such as William Dugdale and Roger Dodsworth devoted decades to transcribing and publishing medieval charters, chronicles, and administrative records that revealed the sophistication of Norman institutional development. Their editorial work made available to later historians primary sources that enabled more accurate assessment of Norman contributions to European political and cultural development. Enlightenment analysis. The Enlightenment period witnessed fundamental reassessments of Norman impact on European civilization, as philosophers and historians developed new interpretive frameworks that emphasized rational analysis of historical causation, rather than providential or mythological explanations of historical change. Enlightenment historians such as David Hume and Edward Gibbon approached Norman history with skeptical methodologies that questioned traditional narratives while seeking to identify the economic, political, and social factors that had enabled Norman success. Their analytical approaches revealed the pragmatic and opportunistic dimensions of Norman expansion, while challenging romanticizing interpretations that had emphasized religious and cultural motivations. Hume on English constitutional development. Hume's History of England, published during the mid-18th century, provided systematic analysis of Norman governmental institutions that emphasized their role in establishing legal and administrative foundations for English constitutional development. His historical narrative presented the Norman conquest as a crucial stage in England's political evolution, rather than a divinely ordained transformation, creating interpretive frameworks that influenced English historical consciousness throughout the modern period. Hume's emphasis on institutional continuity between Norman and later English governmental practices demonstrated the enduring influence of Norman administrative innovations while challenging mythological interpretations of the conquest. Gibbon on cultural preservation. Gibbon's approach to Norman history in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire emphasized the role of Norman conquests in preserving and transmitting classical cultural traditions during periods of political fragmentation and cultural decline. His analysis of Norman Sicily demonstrated the sophisticated cultural synthesis that Norman rulers had achieved through their accommodation of diverse religious and ethnic communities, presenting Norman governmental practices as models of enlightened administration that contrasted favorably with the religious intolerance and political absolutism that characterized many contemporary European states. The Romantic Revival. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries created renewed interest in medieval history that led to both scholarly advances and popular mythologizing of Norman achievements. Romantic historians such as Augustin Thierry and François Guizot developed narrative techniques that combined rigorous documentary research with literary artistry, creating historical works that were both scholarly and accessible to general audiences. Their historical narratives emphasized the dramatic and transformative dimensions of Norman conquests, while maintaining scholarly standards that distinguished their work from earlier mythological interpretations. Thierry's narrative masterpiece. Thierry's History of the Norman Conquest, published in 1825, represented the culmination of Romantic historical writing about Norman achievements, combining extensive archival research with narrative techniques that brought medieval personalities and events to vivid life. His work demonstrated the extent to which Norman conquests had transformed European political structures, while creating literary models for historical writing that influenced scholarly practice throughout the 19th century. The popular success of Thierry's historical narratives demonstrated continuing public fascination with Norman achievements, while establishing interpretive frameworks that emphasized the progressive and modernizing dimensions of Norman rule. The Archaeological Revolution. Modern historical scholarship on the Normans has been revolutionized through archaeological discoveries that have provided material evidence for evaluating the accuracy of medieval chronicles and the extent of Norman cultural transformation. Excavations at major Norman sites such as Battle Abbey, Caen, and Palermo have revealed detailed information about Norman architectural techniques, material culture, and settlement patterns that supplement and sometimes contradict the documentary sources that had previously provided the primary evidence for Norman history. Archaeological evidence has demonstrated the rapid pace of Norman cultural adaptation, while revealing the extent to which Norman rulers incorporated existing architectural and artistic traditions into their building programs. Digging up castle secrets. The archaeological investigation of Norman castles has provided detailed information about construction techniques and defensive innovations that demonstrated the sophisticated engineering capabilities that Norman builders had developed through practical experience in military architecture. Excavations at sites such as Chateau and the Tower of London have revealed the complexity of Norman fortification systems, while providing evidence for the rapid evolution of defensive techniques in response to advances in siege warfare. Archaeological analysis of castle sites has also provided information about the daily life of Norman garrisons and the economic activities that supported these military installations. Sicilian discoveries. Archaeological research in Norman Sicily has revealed the extent of cultural synthesis that occurred under Norman rule, as excavations have uncovered architectural elements, decorative programs, and material artifacts that demonstrate the integration of Byzantine, Islamic, and Western European cultural traditions. The systematic investigation of Norman palaces and churches in Palermo and other Sicilian cities has provided detailed evidence for the multicultural character of Norman court life, while revealing the sophisticated artistic and architectural achievements that resulted from this cultural synthesis. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed the accuracy of medieval descriptions of Norman Sicily's cultural sophistication, while providing material evidence for the practical mechanisms through which this synthesis was achieved. Revising the conquest narrative. The revision of conquest narratives has represented one of the most significant developments in modern Norman historiography, as scholars have moved beyond traditional emphasis on military campaigns and political events to examine the social, economic, and cultural dimensions of Norman expansion. Recent historical research has emphasized the gradual and complex processes through which Norman cultural identity was constructed and transmitted, challenging earlier interpretations that had portrayed Norman conquests as sudden transformations imposed by foreign invaders upon passive native populations. Negotiation, not just domination. Contemporary historians have demonstrated that Norman cultural transformation occurred through processes of negotiation and accommodation, rather than simple imposition of foreign practices upon conquered territories. The systematic analysis of charter evidence and administrative records has revealed the extent to which Norman rulers incorporated existing legal traditions and governmental practices into their administrative systems, while adapting these institutions to serve Norman political purposes. This research has challenged traditional narratives of Norman conquest that had emphasized discontinuity and foreign domination, while revealing the pragmatic and adaptive characteristics that had enabled Norman success in diverse cultural environments. The England debate. The debate over the extent of Norman cultural transformation has been particularly intense among historians studying the Norman impact on English society, as scholars have disagreed about the degree to which Norman rule represented a fundamental break with Anglo-Saxon traditions or a continuation of existing developmental trends. Some historians have emphasized the revolutionary character of Norman governmental innovations, arguing that the conquest introduced continental administrative practices that fundamentally transformed English political and social structures. Other scholars have stressed the continuity between Anglo-Saxon and Norman institutional development, suggesting that Norman rulers built upon existing English governmental foundations rather than imposing entirely foreign administrative systems. New evidence. Nuanced understanding. Recent archaeological and documentary research has provided evidence supporting both interpretive approaches, revealing that Norman impact varied significantly between different regions and social groups within conquered territories. The systematic analysis of Domesday Book evidence has demonstrated that Norman administrative practices incorporated substantial elements of Anglo-Saxon governmental tradition, while introducing innovations that enhanced royal authority and administrative efficiency. This research has created more nuanced understanding of Norman cultural impact that recognizes both continuity and change in the transition from Anglo-Saxon to Norman rule. The living legacy. The contemporary legacy of Norman institutions continues to influence modern European and Anglo-American political and legal traditions through institutional frameworks and legal principles that trace their origins to innovations developed under Norman rule. The common law tradition that emerged from Norman legal innovations has provided foundations for judicial systems throughout the English-speaking world, while the administrative procedures developed in Norman territories have influenced governmental practices in numerous modern democracies. The systematic documentation and standardized procedures that characterized Norman administration established precedents for bureaucratic efficiency and governmental accountability that remain relevant to contemporary political development. From Magna Carta to modern democracy, the English constitutional tradition that emerged from conflicts between Norman kings and their nobility established principles of limited governmental authority and individual legal rights that have influenced democratic development throughout the modern world. The legal protections guaranteed in Magna Carta drew upon Norman legal traditions while establishing constitutional principles that would be incorporated into later democratic constitutions. The concept of due process of law that emerged from Norman judicial innovations has provided foundations for legal systems that protect individual rights while maintaining governmental authority necessary for social order. Stones that still stand. The architectural legacy of Norman building programs continues to influence contemporary construction through design principles and engineering techniques that were pioneered in Norman castles and churches. The structural innovations developed by Norman architects provided foundations for Gothic architectural traditions that have influenced European building practices for centuries. The integration of defensive and residential functions in Norman castle design established architectural precedents that continue to influence institutional and residential construction throughout the modern world. Knowledge preserved, wisdom transmitted. The Norman contribution to European cultural development through their role in preserving and transmitting classical learning has had lasting influence on educational and intellectual traditions throughout the Western world. The libraries and schools established under Norman patronage provided institutional frameworks for scholarly research and educational activities that influenced the development of medieval universities and modern educational systems. The translation movement that flourished in Norman Sicily contributed to the preservation of classical texts that provided foundations for Renaissance humanism and modern scholarly traditions. Conclusion. The Eternal Normans. The Norman legacy in historical memory demonstrates the enduring power of historical narratives to shape cultural identity and political consciousness long after the events they commemorate have passed into history. The romanticizing myths that developed around Norman achievements provided source material for national narratives that influenced European political development, while creating cultural traditions that continue to influence popular understanding of medieval history. The scholarly reassessment of Norman history during the modern period has revealed both the accuracy and the limitations of these mythological interpretations, while demonstrating the continuing relevance of Norman institutional innovations to contemporary political and legal development. Memory becomes legend. Legend becomes truth. The transformation of Norman identity from political reality to historical memory illustrates the complex processes through which historical events acquire cultural significance that transcends their immediate political impact. The Norman achievement in creating sophisticated governmental institutions, facilitating cultural exchange, and adapting to diverse political environments provided models for political development that have influenced European civilization for over a millennium. The continuing scholarly interest in Norman history reflects both the intrinsic fascination of their remarkable achievements and the enduring relevance of their institutional innovations to contemporary challenges of governance, cultural diversity, and international relations. Final reflection. What the Normans teach us. From Viking raiders to medieval administrators to historical memory, represents one of the most remarkable transformations in European history, demonstrating the capacity of relatively small groups to achieve disproportionate historical influence through military skill, administrative innovation, and cultural adaptability that enabled them to succeed in diverse environments across the medieval world. Their legacy lives on not just in the castles and cathedrals that still dot the European landscape, not just in the legal traditions and governmental institutions that shape modern democracies, but in the very idea that adaptability, innovation, and pragmatism can triumph over rigid ideology and brute force. The Normans showed medieval Europe, and through it, the modern world, that conquest was only the beginning. True power came from building systems that would outlast individual rulers, from synthesizing diverse cultures rather than crushing them. From creating institutions that serve practical needs while inspiring loyalty and legitimacy. From fjords to forever. From the fjords of Scandinavia to the courts of Sicily. From the battlefields of Hastings to the negotiating tables of Runnymede. The Normans left an indelible mark on Western civilization. Their story reminds us that history belongs not just to those who win battles, but to those who build systems, create institutions, and shape the future through innovation and adaptation. The age of Norman political power ended centuries ago, but the age of Norman influence continues to this day. Every time a court applies principles of due process, every time a government maintains systematic records, every time diverse cultures find ways to coexist within unified political frameworks, the Norman legacy lives on. Closing words. They were Vikings who became Frenchmen, conquerors who became administrators, warriors who became patrons of art and learning, foreigners who became the foundation of English identity. They adapted, they innovated, they synthesized, they endured, and in doing so, they changed the world. The Normans may be gone, but they are not forgotten. Their achievements echo through the centuries, reminding us that the greatest conquerors are not those who simply take, but those who build something lasting from what they've taken. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through Norman history. From Viking longships to Mediterranean kingdoms, from castle keeps to constitutional principles, we've traced the remarkable path of a people who refused to be defined by their origins, and instead defined themselves through their achievements. The Norman saga is complete, but their story, our story, continues.